You don't love me. Clara Whitmore's voice cracked like autumn ice as she faced the stranger who'd haunted her vineyard for weeks. Elias Ward stood in the cellar's shadows, federal agents thundering above their heads, his hands stained with soil and secrets. "Then why can't I stop looking at you?" he whispered, stepping closer until she could see the desperation in his storm-gray eyes. What happened next would destroy her reputation, challenge everything she believed about trust, and force her to choose between the safety of solitude and the dangerous promise of a love she'd sworn never to feel again. This is their story, a tale of forbidden passion, deadly secrets, and the kind of courage that only blooms when you have everything to lose. Stay with me until the end, and comment below what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The morning fog rolled thick across Sonoma Valley on September 14th, 1891, the kind that turned the world into a ghost of itself. Clara Whitmore stood at the kitchen window of the farmhouse she no longer thought of as home, just the place where she slept between endless days of work. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, a woman of 32 who looked 40, dark hair pulled severely back, hands already rough before the sun had fully risen. 3 years. 3 years since Thomas had been thrown from a spooked horse and broken his neck in an instant, leaving her with 200 acres of vineyard, a mortgage that grew heavier each month, and a son who barely remembered his father's face. She poured coffee from the pot on the stove, the bitter smell mixing with the wood smoke that never quite left the house. Outside, the vine stretched in neat rows toward the hills, heavy with grapes that needed picking. The harvest was late this year. She'd lost 2 workers to the railroad crews that paid better wages, and the remaining 3 couldn't keep pace. Every day that passed meant fruit rotting on the vine, meant money she couldn't afford to lose. Clara had learned to carry worry the way other women carried parasols, constantly, without thinking about it. But this morning something else weighted the air, a feeling she couldn't name, like the pressure before a storm. She was draining her cup when she saw him. A figure emerged from the fog at the end of the drive, walking with the steady gait of someone who'd covered many miles. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that had seen better years and carrying a pack that looked like it held everything he owned. He paused at the gate, studying the sign that read Whitmore Vineyard in faded letters, then continued up toward the house. Clara's hand moved instinctively to the rifle that leaned beside the door. Drifters weren't uncommon, men displaced by war or circumstance, looking for work or trouble, often both. She'd turned away dozens over the years, had learned to read danger in the set of a man's shoulders, the way he moved, but something about this one made her hesitate. He stopped at a respectful distance from the porch, removed his hat. His hair was dark and overlong, his face weathered by sun and time, but his eyes, even from 20 feet away, she could see they were the color of storm clouds, and they held something she recognized because she saw it in her own mirror every morning. Loss. The kind that didn't heal, just scarred over. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough, like it wasn't used often. "I'm looking for work. Day labor, harvest work, anything you need. I don't drink, I don't steal, and I can outwork any 2 men you've got." Clara kept her hand near the rifle. "That's what they all say." "Yes, ma'am, but I can prove it. I can't pay much. I'm not asking for much." She studied him in the gray morning light. He stood utterly still, not fidgeting or pushing, just waiting. There was something military in his bearing, though he wore no uniform, no insignia. His hands, she noticed, were scarred across the knuckles, the kind of scars you got from hard work, not bar fights. "What's your name?" "Elias Ward." "Where are you from, Mr. Ward?" "Originally, Virginia, but I've been moving west for a while now." "Running from something?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Running to something, maybe. Or just running. Hard to say anymore." The honesty surprised her. Most drifters had elaborate stories prepared, tales designed to elicit sympathy or trust. This man offered neither explanation nor excuse. "I've got 3 workers already," Clara said, "and limited funds. I'll work for food and a place to sleep. You can pay me at the end of the season when you sell the crop. If you're not satisfied, you owe me nothing." "That's a fool's bargain." "Maybe, but it's the one I'm offering." Clara glanced toward the vineyard, where the weight of unharvested grapes bent the vines. She thought of the mortgage payment due in 6 weeks, of her son James's shoes that were too small, of the roof that leaked in the north bedroom. She thought of all the practical, sensible reasons to turn this stranger away. And then she thought of the alternative, losing everything Thomas had built, everything she'd fought to keep. "All right," she heard herself say. "You can sleep in the barn loft. There's a pump for washing. Meals are at 6, noon, and 6. You work when I say work, you stop when I say stop, and you stay away from my son. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We start in 30 minutes. He nodded once, turned toward the barn. Clara watched him walk away, his movements economical and purposeful. She felt a flutter of unease in her chest. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Something that whispered she'd just invited a storm into her carefully controlled life. She was right, but she wouldn't know how right for 3 more weeks. The work began before dawn and ended after dark, the rhythm of harvest consuming everything else. Clara ran her vineyard the way a general might run a campaign, efficiently, ruthlessly, with no tolerance for waste or weakness. She'd learned it from Thomas in the early years, and she'd perfected it after his death, when survival depended on squeezing every possible dollar from every possible grape. Elias Ward fit into this rhythm like he'd been born to it. He showed up that first morning with the others, Antonio and Miguel, brothers from Mexico who returned each season, and old Peter, who'd been working the valley since before the war. The men eyed him with the suspicion workers always showed newcomers, but by mid-morning, that suspicion had shifted to grudging respect. The man could work. He moved through the rows with steady, tireless efficiency, his hands quick and sure as he cut the heavy clusters and laid them in baskets. He didn't pause to wipe sweat or stretch his back, didn't waste motion or time. When a wagon wheel broke under the weight of full baskets, he had it fixed before Clara could even fetch tools. When Miguel's knife slipped and opened a gash in his hand, Elias produced a clean cloth and wrapped the wound with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd tended many injuries. "You a doctor?" Miguel asked, wincing. "Was. Long time ago." "What happened?" "War happened." That was all he said, and Miguel knew better than to push. They all had things they didn't talk about. Clara watched him from a distance that first day, and the second, and the third. She told herself it was prudent management, keeping an eye on the new worker, making sure he wasn't stealing or shirking. But the truth, which she barely admitted to herself, was that she found him fascinating. There was something about the way he moved, the way he inhabited space, that drew her attention like iron to a lodestone. It wasn't attraction. She'd locked that part of herself away when they buried Thomas, and she had no intention of opening it again. It was something else. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. The sense that this man carried secrets as heavy as her own and wore them just as quietly. On the 4th evening, she found him in the barn after dinner, currying the old draft horse they used for the wagon. James, her 8-year-old son, sat on an overturned bucket nearby, watching with rapt attention. "And then what happened?" James asked, his eyes wide. "Then the cavalry came over the ridge, and everything got very loud, very fast," Elias said, his voice gentle in a way it never was during the day. "But we held the position. That's what mattered." "Were you scared?" "Terrified. Anyone who says they're not scared in battle is either a liar or a fool. Papa said soldiers were brave. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing what needs doing anyway." Well, Clara stepped into the doorway. "James, bedtime." Her son jumped, startled. "But, Mama—" "Now." James slouched toward the door, dragging his feet. Elias continued brushing the horse, not looking up. When the boy had disappeared into the house, Clara crossed her arms. "I told you to stay away from my son." "He came to me, ma'am. I didn't seek him out." "Then send him away." "I tried. He's persistent. Try harder." Now Elias looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "I will if you insist, but he's a lonely boy, and I think he misses having a man around." The words hit like a slap. Clara felt her face flush hot. "You don't know anything about my son or what he needs." "You're right. I apologize." He went back to brushing the horse. The rhythm of it, steady, methodical, seemed to fill the barn. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, caught between anger and something else. something that felt dangerously like gratitude. Because he wasn't wrong. James was lonely. She saw it every day in the way he trailed after the workers, in the way he invented elaborate games with stick-figure armies, in the way he asked endless questions about his father that she couldn't bear to answer. "He can talk to you during evening chores," she heard herself say, "but only then, and nothing about war. He has nightmares enough already." Elias nodded. "Understood." Clara turned to leave, then paused. "You said you were a doctor." "Field surgeon, during the war." "Why'd you stop?" His hand stilled on the brush. "Because I got tired of cutting pieces off men who were too young to die. Because I couldn't save the ones who mattered. Because, when it was over, I couldn't stomach the sight of blood anymore." He resumed brushing. "Take your pick." The raw honesty of it stopped her breath. She wanted to press, to ask more, but something in his voice, the flat, dead tone of a man who'd looked into hell, warned her away. "Good night, Mr. Ward." "Good night, Mrs. Whitmore." She walked back to the house through the blue dusk, her arms wrapped around herself against a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Behind her she heard the soft whicker of the horse and the whisper of brush through mane, and she wondered, not for the first time, what kind of man she'd invited onto her land. The days bled into each other, measured in baskets of grapes and the slow progress of the harvest. The weather held fair, which was a blessing, but it also meant the heat pressed down like a blanket, thick and relentless. They worked in the relative cool of early morning and late evening, taking shelter during the worst of the afternoon sun. Elias proved himself invaluable. He could fix anything that broke, diagnose problems before they became catastrophic, and work longer hours than men half his age. Antonio started calling him El Toro, the bull, and meant it as a compliment. Even old Peter, who trusted no one and liked even fewer, admitted the new man pulled his weight. But it was the small things that unsettled Clara most. The way Elias always positioned himself between her and any approaching stranger, as if guarding her without being asked. The way he saved the choicest bits of his dinner for the barn cats, feeding them with gentle hands. The way she sometimes caught him standing at the edge of the vineyard at sunset, staring at the hills with an expression of such profound sadness that it made her chest ache. And the drawings. She discovered them by accident 2 weeks into the harvest. She'd gone to the barn looking for extra rope and found a battered leather journal lying open on a hay bale. The page showed a sketch of the vineyard at dawn, the rows of vines emerging from mist, every detail rendered with startling skill, the curve of the hills, the way light caught on leaves, the old oak tree that marked the western boundary. Clara knew she shouldn't look. Privacy was sacred, one of the few things people owned outright. But she couldn't help herself. She turned the page and then another. The journal was full of drawings, landscapes mostly, mountains, rivers, small towns, all rendered with the same meticulous care, but also faces. A young woman with laughing eyes, an old man smoking a pipe, a boy of maybe 6 caught mid-run, and on one page, just one, a sketch that looked nothing like the others. Rough, almost violent strokes forming a scene of chaos and smoke, of bodies and blood, and something that might have been a cannon. "You shouldn't be looking at that." Clara jumped, dropping the journal. Elias stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon light. She couldn't see his face, couldn't read his expression, but his voice carried a note of something dark. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was looking for rope and I saw... I shouldn't have... No, you shouldn't have." He crossed the barn in 3 long strides, scooped up the journal, and shoved it into his pack. His movements were sharp, almost angry, so different from his usual measured calm that Clara took an involuntary step back. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "The drawings. You're very talented. They're private. I know. I'm sorry." Elias stood with his back to her, his shoulders rigid. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, "The boy in the drawings. That was my son." Was past tense. Clara's breath caught. "Mr. Ward, his name was Daniel. He was 7 years old when he died of scarlet fever. My wife, Hannah, she died 2 weeks later of the same thing. I was in Tennessee cutting off soldiers' legs, and I couldn't save my own family." He turned to face her, and his eyes were terrible. So yes, Mrs. Whitmore, I can draw. I draw because it's the only thing that keeps me from forgetting their faces. And I'd appreciate it if you respected that. He walked past her, out of the barn and into the bright afternoon. Clara stood alone in the shadows, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart hammered against her ribs. She understood now, understood the sorrow she'd sensed, the careful distance he kept from everything and everyone, the way he'd warned James away from battle stories. This man wasn't running from something. He was running from the memory of everything he'd lost. That night, Clara lay awake in her bedroom, listening to the house settle around her. Moonlight streamed through the curtains, painting silver bars across the floor. She'd apologized at dinner, a quiet word offered across the table, and Elias had nodded acceptance without meeting her eyes. The meal had been tense, uncomfortable, James chattering to fill the silence while the adults pushed food around their plates. Now, in the darkness, Clara found herself thinking about Hannah and Daniel Ward. She wondered what they'd looked like beyond the sketches, what their voices had sounded like, whether they'd been happy. She wondered how a man survived that kind of loss, both wife and child, in a single month, and kept moving forward. She knew something about loss, of course. Thomas's death had hollowed her out, left her functioning but not quite living. But she still had James, still had purpose. What did you do when everything was taken? How did you find reasons to keep drawing breath? Clara rose and walked to the window, looked out across the vineyard bathed in pale light. She could just make out the barn, its dark shape against the sky. A light flickered in the loft window, candle or lantern, and she imagined Elias up there, unable to sleep, drawing faces he could never touch again. Something shifted in her chest. Not attraction, she wouldn't call it that, couldn't call it that, but recognition. The acknowledgement that grief had touched them both had marked them as members of the same terrible club. And maybe, just maybe, that gave them something in common beyond employer and employee, beyond the transactional nature of work and wages. Maybe that made them something close to equals. The thought terrified her more than she wanted to admit. Bob. The next morning dawned gray and cool, the first hint of autumn's arrival. Clara found Elias already working when she arrived at the vineyard, his movements mechanical and efficient. She worked alongside him in silence for a while, filling her own baskets before speaking. My husband died 3 years ago. Thrown from a horse. Elias's hands paused, just for a second, then resumed cutting. James barely remembers him now. Sometimes he'll say something, Papa used to do this, or Papa said that. But I can see he's pulling from stories I've told him, not real memories. And I don't know if that's better or worse. It's both, Elias said quietly. Forgetting means the pain fades, but it also means they really are gone. Clara nodded, though he wasn't looking at her. I was angry for a long time, angry at Thomas for dying, for leaving me with all of this, for breaking his promise to grow old together. Angry at God for taking him, angry at myself for being angry. Did it help? The anger? No, it just made me tired. They worked side by side until the basket was full, then moved to the next row. The sun broke through the clouds, warming the air, and Clara could feel sweat beginning to gather at the small of her back. I shouldn't have looked at your journal, she said. I genuinely am sorry for that, but I'm not sorry I saw the drawings because they helped me understand. Understand what? Why you are the way you are. Elias finally looked at her, his storm-gray eyes searching her face. And how am I? Careful. Guarded. Like you're afraid that if you let yourself feel anything, you'll shatter. He flinched as if she'd struck him. That's an uncomfortably accurate assessment, Mrs. Whitmore. You can call me Clara, when it's just us. I don't think that's appropriate. Probably not. But I'm doing it anyway. And I'll call you Elias, if that's all right. He studied her for a long moment, and Clara felt herself flush under the intensity of his gaze. It wasn't romantic or flirtatious. It was something deeper than that, something that felt like recognition, like he was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. All right, he said finally. Clara. The sound of her name in his voice did something strange to her equilibrium, made her feel unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the uneven ground. She turned back to the vines quickly, before he could see the confusion on her face. They didn't speak much for the rest of the day, but the silence between them had changed. It felt less like distance and more like understanding, the comfortable quiet of two people who didn't need words to communicate. And when their hands accidentally brushed reaching for the same cluster of grapes, Clara felt a jolt of something electric that she absolutely, definitely was not going to think about. Definitely not. The following weeks brought a change in the rhythm of the vineyard. The harvest progressed well, ahead of schedule in fact, thanks largely to Elias's tireless work. The cellars filled with barrels of pressed grape juice that would become wine, the air thick with the sweet-sour smell of fermentation. Clara found herself able to breathe a little easier, able to imagine making the mortgage payment with money left over for James's winter clothes and repairs to the wagon. But more than that, something had shifted in the daily pattern of life. Elias and James had formed an unlikely friendship, the boy trailing after the man during evening chores, asking endless questions that Elias answered with patient thoroughness. Clara watched them from the kitchen window, watched Elias teach her son to properly harness the horse, to sharpen a knife, to identify different types of clouds and what weather they portended. She told herself she allowed it only because James needed male guidance, because he was hungry for the kind of practical knowledge his father would have taught him. But the truth, which she acknowledged only in her most honest moments, was that she liked seeing her son happy. She liked hearing his laughter ring out across the yard. She liked the way he bounced into the house at bedtime, breathless with stories about what Elias had shown him. And she liked, though she would never admit it aloud, the sound of Elias's rare laughter, low and rumbling, when James said something particularly clever or outrageous. One evening, Clara was washing dishes when she heard voices outside. James's high and excited, Elias's deeper and measured. She dried her hands and stepped onto the porch, meaning to call her son in for bed, but stopped when she saw them. They stood in the yard beneath a sky full of stars, James pointing upward while Elias traced invisible lines between constellations. "That's Cassiopeia," Elias was saying, "the vain queen who angered the gods. And there, see that W shape? That's her chair. Tell me another one. All right, see those 3 bright stars in a row? That's Orion's belt. Orion was a great hunter who—" "I thought you were supposed to be in bed, young man," Clara interrupted. James spun around. "But Mama, Elias is teaching me the stars." "Elias needs his rest, and so do you. Say good night." Her son's face fell, but he knew better than to argue. "Good night, Elias. Thank you for the stories." "Good night, James. Sweet dreams." The boy trudged toward the house, dragging his feet with dramatic emphasis. Clara waited until he was inside before turning to Elias. "You don't have to spend your evenings entertaining him." "I don't mind. He's a good kid. Smart, too. He's growing attached to you." "Is that a problem?" Clara hesitated. The honest answer was yes, it was a problem, because Elias wouldn't stay forever. Harvest workers never did. They moved with the seasons, following work and weather. And when he left, James would be hurt all over again, would lose another man he'd come to care about. But she couldn't say that without revealing too much, without admitting that she'd thought about Elias leaving and found the prospect more unsettling than it should be. "Just be careful with him," she said instead. "He's already lost one father." "I know. I'll be careful." Elias started toward the barn, then paused. "Clara, thank you." "For what?" "For letting me be part of this, even temporarily. It feels good to be useful again." He disappeared into the darkness before she could respond, leaving her standing in the yard with her arms wrapped around herself against the October chill. Above her, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human concerns. Cassiopeia in her chair, Orion with his belt, all the celestial stories that had outlasted empires. Clara wondered what stories future generations would tell about this time, this place, this harvest season when a widow and a drifter had worked side by side under these same stars. Probably none. They were just ordinary people living ordinary lives, remarkable only to themselves. And yet there was something building between them, something neither acknowledged but both felt. It hummed in the air like electricity before a storm, crackled in the space between their hands when they passed tools back and forth. It made her hyper-aware of his presence, made her notice when he entered a room, made her skin prickle when he stood close, made her dreams take strange and troubling turns. Clara lay awake that night, listening to the wind rattle the windows, and admitted what she'd been avoiding for weeks. She was attracted to Elias Ward. It was inconvenient, inappropriate, and potentially disastrous. He was her employee. He was clearly still grieving his wife. He had secrets. She sensed them in the way his eyes sometimes went distant, in the careful way he spoke about his past. And most importantly, he would leave when the season ended, would walk back down that foggy drive carrying everything he owned, and leave her exactly where she'd been before he arrived. Alone. The realization hurt more than it should have, which was how she knew she was in trouble. Because Clara Whitmore had built her life on careful control, on not needing anyone, on being sufficient unto herself. And here she was, lying in the darkness, thinking about a man who drew pictures of his dead family and had a smile that could light up rooms when he chose to use it. She was in trouble. Deep, complicated, terrifying trouble. And the worst part? She wasn't entirely sure she wanted to be rescued. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, riding a bay mare and wearing a silver star. Clara was in the cellar checking fermentation when she heard horses in the yard. By the time she emerged, 2 men had dismounted and were speaking to Antonio, who pointed toward the house with obvious reluctance. The men wore badges, local sheriff and deputy, she realized as she got closer, recognizing Sheriff Morton from town. "Sheriff," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "What can I do for you?" Morton was a thick man in his 50s with the kind of face that looked perpetually skeptical. He touched his hat brim. "Mrs. Whitmore, sorry to disturb you. We're looking for someone." Clara's stomach tightened. "Who?" "Man goes by the name Elias Ward. Been told he's working for you." Every instinct screamed at her to lie, to claim ignorance, to protect the man who'd become more important than he should be. But lying to law enforcement was a crime in itself, and besides, half the valley knew Elias worked the Whitmore vineyard. "He does work for me, yes. What's this about?" The deputy stepped forward, a younger man with eager eyes. "We have questions regarding his activities before arriving in California." "What kind of activities?" "The kind we'd prefer to discuss with him directly," Morton said. "Is he here?" Clara's mind raced. Elias was in the south field, probably half a mile away. She could claim not to know his exact location, could give him time to what? Run? Hide? If he'd done something illegal, was she obligated to help the law, or was she obligated to the man who'd proven himself decent and hardworking for 6 solid weeks? Before she could answer, a voice spoke from behind her. "I'm Ward." Clara spun. Elias emerged from the barn, his face carefully neutral. He walked toward them with that same measured gait, neither hurrying nor hanging back. James appeared in the doorway behind him, eyes wide. "James, inside," Clara said sharply. For once, her son obeyed without question. Elias stopped at a respectful distance from the lawman. "You're looking for me?" Morton studied him with hard eyes. "Elias Ward, formerly of the Army Medical Corps? That's right. You're wanted for questioning in connection with illegal activities in Nevada." Clara's breath caught. "What kind of activities?" "Smuggling and aiding criminals," the deputy said, clearly enjoying the drama. "There's a warrant out of Carson City." "I see," Elias said calmly, too calmly. "May I ask what evidence supports these charges?" "You'll have the opportunity to address that with the federal marshal. Right now you need to come with us." "Am I under arrest?" Morton hesitated. "Not yet. But if you refuse to cooperate, that can change real quick." Clara found her voice. "This is absurd. Mr. Ward has been working here for 6 weeks, and he's done nothing but honest labor. He's not a smuggler or a criminal." "That may be, ma'am, but we have our orders." Elias met her eyes, and in that brief glance she saw a whole conversation: gratitude, apology, resignation. Then he looked back at the sheriff. "I'll cooperate, but I need to collect my things." "Deputy will accompany you." "Of course." Elias walked back to the barn, the deputy close behind. Clara stood frozen in the yard, her mind spinning. This had to be a mistake. Some confusion or bureaucratic error. Elias was many things: reserved, damaged, mysterious. But he wasn't a criminal. She'd have sensed it, would have seen it in the way he moved through the world. Wouldn't she? Morton cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore, I should tell you, the charges are serious. If you know anything about Ward's activities here, you should speak up now. He works. He eats. He sleeps. That's all I know. He mention anyone from his past? Any visitors or unusual behavior? No, nothing. That was the truth. Elias had been the model employee, punctual, hardworking, solitary. If he had secrets, he'd kept them well hidden. Elias emerged from the barn carrying his battered pack, the leather journal visible at the top. The deputy had his hand on his gun, as if expecting trouble, but Elias moved with the same calm purposefulness as always. He stopped in front of Clara. Thank you for the work, he said quietly, and tell James I'm sorry I couldn't finish teaching him about the stars. What's happening? What are they talking about? Old mistakes catching up with me. Story of my life lately. But you didn't do what they're saying, did you? His eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that made her chest constrict, a deep, weary sadness, but also something that might have been honesty. It's complicated, he said. But no, not the way they think. Then fight it, explain. I will. But Clara... He glanced at the lawman, then back to her, lowering his voice. If anyone comes asking about me, be careful what you say. Some people have long memories and deep pockets, and they don't like being crossed. What does that mean? It means take care of yourself and James. That's all that matters. Morton interrupted. Ward, let's move. Elias nodded once to Clara, then turned and walked toward the horses. The deputy bound his hands, loosely, almost apologetically, and helped him mount behind Morton. Clara stood in the yard, her fists clenched at her sides, watching as they rode away down the drive and disappeared into the afternoon haze. When they were gone, she became aware of others watching, Antonio and Miguel standing by the press, old Peter near the equipment shed, and James on the porch, his face pale with confusion. The workers knew better than to comment, but Clara could feel their unspoken questions hanging in the air. She wanted to scream at them, to defend Elias, to explain that this was obviously a mistake, but the words wouldn't come, because a treacherous part of her mind was already whispering doubts. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if the man she'd welcomed onto her land, the man she'd allowed near her son, the man she'd been developing feelings for, what if he really was a criminal? What if she'd been a fool? Brahmi. The evening stretched long and uncomfortable. Clara made dinner mechanically, her mind elsewhere, while James peppered her with questions she couldn't answer. Where did they take Elias? What did smuggling mean? When would he come back? She put her son to bed early, endured his tears and protests, and then sat alone at the kitchen table with a glass of Thomas's whiskey that she didn't drink. The house felt emptier than usual, which was ridiculous because Elias had never been inside it, had kept to the barn and the fields, maintaining proper boundaries. But his absence was palpable nonetheless, a hole in the fabric of their routine that she felt acutely. Antonio came to the door just after dark, hat in hand. Senora, Miguel and I, we have been talking. This thing with Elias, you want to know if he's a criminal. We want to know if we should be worried, for you and the boy. Clara appreciated the concern, even as it frustrated her. I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what's true. He is a good man, Antonio said firmly. Miguel and I, we have worked with many men, some good, some bad. Elias, he is good. Whatever they say he did, there is more to the story. How can you be sure? Because bad men, they cannot hide what they are. Not every day, not for weeks. It shows in how they treat people, in the small things. Elias, he is patient with James. He is kind to the animals. He works hard and asks for nothing. These are not the actions of a bad man. The simple certainty in Antonio's voice eased something tight in Clara's chest. She wanted to believe it, wanted to trust the instincts that said Elias was decent, that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But 3 years of managing the vineyard alone had taught her to be skeptical, to trust facts over feelings. Thank you, Antonio. I hope you're right. He nodded and left. Clara sat alone again, staring at the untouched whiskey, until the candles burned low and the darkness outside pressed against the windows like a living thing. Finally, she climbed the stairs to bed, knowing sleep would be elusive. She was right. She lay awake until the small hours, her mind churning through every interaction with Elias, looking for signs she'd missed. But all she could remember was the careful way he handled tools, the gentleness with which he treated James, the profound sadness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. And the drawings. All those beautiful, heartbreaking drawings of people he'd loved and lost. Whatever Elias Ward had done, whatever mistakes or choices had led to this moment, Clara found she couldn't believe he was the villain they were making him out to be. There was too much humanity in those sketches, too much genuine grief in the way he'd spoken about his wife and son. But belief and truth weren't always the same thing. And as dawn broke gray and cold over the vineyard, Clara rose to face another day of work and worry, of questions without answers, of the gnawing fear that she'd let herself care about someone who would only bring more loss into her carefully constructed life. The fall harvest continued without Elias, but the rhythm was wrong, the pace slower despite everyone working harder to compensate. Clara threw herself into the work with almost desperate intensity, as if exhaustion could quiet the doubts that plagued her waking hours. It didn't work. On the third day after Elias's arrest, a stranger appeared at the vineyard. He was well-dressed, city clothes, expensive boots, and rode a horse that probably cost more than Clara made in a year. He introduced himself as Thomas Blackwood, lawyer from Carson City, and asked to speak with her privately. They sat in the parlor that Clara rarely used, the room that still held Thomas's books and hunting trophies. Blackwood declined refreshments and got straight to business. "Mrs. Whitmore, I represent certain interests in Nevada who have concerns about Elias Ward." "What kind of interests?" "Business interests, specifically railroad development and associated commerce. Mr. Ward made certain accusations against my clients, accusations that proved to be false and damaging. When he couldn't substantiate his claims, he fled the state. Now he's been located, and we're simply seeking justice." Clara kept her face neutral. "What accusations?" "That's a matter for the courts, but I wanted to speak with you because I understand you employed Mr. Ward, and I wanted to ensure you understood the gravity of the situation." "I understood that he's wanted for questioning, yes. He's wanted for far more than questioning, I assure you. The man is dangerous, Mrs. Whitmore. A fabricator and possibly worse. And anyone who aids him, even unknowingly, could find themselves in a very difficult position." The threat was barely veiled. Clara felt her spine stiffen. "I hired a harvest worker. I knew nothing about his past. If that makes me guilty of something, you'll have to explain to me what." "Of course not. I simply wanted to ensure you understood the situation, and to offer my clients assistance should you find yourself in need of legal counsel or other support." "Other support?" "Your mortgage, for instance. I understand it comes due soon. My clients have resources that could help, should you find yourself short, in exchange for your cooperation." Now Clara understood. This wasn't about justice. It was about buying her silence, about ensuring she wouldn't testify on Elias's behalf or question the charges too loudly. The mortgage was just leverage, a pressure point they could exploit. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your concern, but my financial affairs are my own. And as for Elias Ward, I barely knew the man. If he committed crimes, I hope he's punished appropriately. If he didn't, I hope the truth comes out. Beyond that, I have nothing to say." Blackwood studied her for a long moment, his expression calculating. Then he smiled, cold and thin. "Very well. But should you change your mind, please don't hesitate to contact me. My card." He left it on the table and departed. Clara didn't pick it up, didn't want to touch anything connected to this man and his interests. Instead, she sat in the quiet parlor, her hands trembling slightly, and understood that Elias's situation was far more complex than a simple criminal charge. Someone powerful wanted him silenced, and they were willing to threaten a widow and her small vineyard to ensure it happened. The question was, what had Elias done to earn such powerful enemies? And more importantly, was he guilty or was he being framed by people with deeper pockets and longer reach than truth or justice? Clara walked to the window, looked out across her vineyard bathed in October light. The vines were nearly bare now, the harvest almost complete. In a few weeks, the workers would move on, The press would fall silent, and she'd be alone again with James and the endless work of survival. But everything felt different now. Elias's presence had changed something fundamental, had woken parts of her she'd thought safely buried. And his absence, his wrongful absence, she was increasingly certain, left a void that mere work couldn't fill. She thought about the drawings in his journal, about Daniel and Hannah Ward, about a man so broken by loss that he'd wandered west looking for nothing but escape. She thought about the way he'd taught James to see constellations, the care with which he'd treated the animals, the tireless work ethic that never asked for recognition or reward. And she thought about Blackwood's veiled threats, about powerful men willing to destroy anyone who got in their way, about the difference between law and justice. Clara had spent 3 years playing it safe, avoiding risk, building walls around her heart. But walls could be prisons too, and safety could look an awful lot like cowardice. She picked up Blackwood's card from the table, walked to the stove, and fed it to the flames. Then she went to the desk, pulled out paper and pen, and began writing a letter to the courthouse in Carson City. She didn't know if it would help, didn't know if anyone would even read it, but she would state what she knew, that Elias Ward had been an exemplary worker, that he'd shown nothing but decency and integrity, that whatever he was accused of deserved a fair hearing and real investigation. It wasn't much, but it was something, and maybe something was enough to start. Antonio found her there an hour later, the letter finished and sealed. He stood in the doorway, his weathered face grave. "Señora, there is news from town about Elias." Clara's heart seized. "What kind of news?" "They are taking him to San Francisco tomorrow to face a federal judge. After that, they will send him back to Nevada for trial." "So quickly?" "The railroad, it has much power. They push for fast justice." Fast justice. Clara almost laughed at the phrase, except there was nothing funny about it. Fast justice usually meant no justice at all, just powerful people getting what they wanted while ordinary people got swept aside. She looked down at her letter, at her careful handwriting spelling out her faith in a man she barely knew. It seemed so inadequate, so powerless against the machinery of wealth and influence, but it was all she had. "Antonio, can you ride to town tomorrow morning? I need this posted immediately." "Of course. And Señora, if you want to see him, to speak with him before they take him away, you should go tonight. They are holding him at the sheriff's office." Clara hadn't considered that possibility. The thought of seeing Elias in a cell, of confronting him with her questions and doubts, made her stomach clench. But Antonio was right. If she waited, the chance would be gone. "Can you stay with James for a few hours?" "Miguel and we will both stay. You go. You need answers, I think." He was right about that too. Clara changed into her better dress, the dark blue one she wore to church, and hitched the wagon. The ride to town took 40 minutes, the October evening cool and clear. She rehearsed what she'd say, calm, direct questions, no emotion, just seeking truth. But as the lights of town appeared ahead, her carefully prepared words scattered like leaves in wind. Because the truth was, she didn't just want answers. She wanted to see him, to know he was all right, to tell him that she believed him, even though she had no logical reason to believe anything at all. She wanted, God help her, to not be alone in her faith that decent men could still exist in a world that seemed determined to crush them. The sheriff's office was a small building at the end of Main Street, light spilling from its windows into the darkness. Clara tied the horse, smoothed her dress, and walked inside before her courage could fail. The sheriff's office smelled of coffee and old tobacco, a masculine space that made Clara feel immediately out of place. Sheriff Morton looked up from his desk with evident surprise, his bushy eyebrows rising toward his hairline. "Mrs. Whitmore, didn't expect to see you here." "I'd like to speak with Elias Ward, if that's possible." Morton leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "That's irregular, ma'am. He's being held pending transport." "I'm aware. But he worked for me for 6 weeks, and I have questions that deserve answers before he's taken away. Surely you can allow me 10 minutes. The sheriff studied her face, and Clara met his gaze without flinching. She'd learned long ago that men often underestimated widows, assumed grief had made them weak or pliable. But grief could also forge steel, and she'd been tempered in fires Morton couldn't imagine. 10 minutes, he said finally, and I'll be right outside the door. He led her down a short hallway to a pair of cells. Only one was occupied. Elias sat on a narrow cot, his back against the wall, staring at nothing. He looked up when they approached, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, then something warmer that he quickly shuddered. "You have a visitor, Ward." Morton unlocked the door but left it slightly ajar. 10 minutes. Behave yourself. Clara stepped into the cell, and the door clicked shut behind her. The space was tiny, maybe 8 feet by 6, with barely room for the cot, a bucket, and 2 people standing. She remained near the door while Elias rose to his feet. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. "I had to. I need to understand what's happening. It's complicated. That's what you said before. I need more than that now." Elias ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration or exhaustion or both. In the lamplight from the hallway, she could see he looked tired, deep lines around his eyes, shadows beneath them that hadn't been there before. "What do you know?" he asked. "I know you're accused of smuggling and aiding criminals in Nevada. I know railroad interests are involved. I know a lawyer named Blackwood came to my home today and threatened me." His expression darkened. "He threatened you? How?" "He mentioned my mortgage, offered his clients financial assistance in exchange for my cooperation, which I assume means my silence." "God damn it!" Elias turned away, his hands clenching into fists. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. Clara, you need to stay away from this. From me. These people. They don't make idle threats." "Then tell me what happened. Help me understand why they're so desperate to silence you." He was quiet for so long she thought he might refuse. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside him. "After Hannah and Daniel died, I didn't handle it well. I drank too much, worked too little, basically fell apart. When I finally pulled myself together enough to function, I needed money. I took a job with a railroad company in Nevada, Western Continental. They were building a new line through the mountains, and they needed doctors for the work crews." "That sounds legitimate." "It was. At first, but about 6 months in, I started noticing things. Workers getting sick with symptoms that didn't make sense, equipment failures that seemed suspicious, small accidents that added up to something bigger. So I started asking questions." Clara moved closer, drawn by the intensity in his voice. "What did you find?" "That Western Continental was cutting corners in ways that were killing people, using substandard materials, ignoring safety protocols, bribing inspectors to look the other way. And when workers got injured or killed, they covered it up, paid off families, falsified records, made people disappear." "Disappear?" "Workers who complained too loudly had a habit of vanishing. At first I thought they'd just been fired and moved on, but then I found graves. Unmarked graves up in the mountains, bodies buried without ceremony or record. Men who'd threatened to go to the authorities about what was happening." Clara's hand went to her throat. "That's murder." "Yes, but proving it was another matter. I started keeping records, documenting injuries, collecting evidence, and when I had enough, I went to the federal marshal in Carson City." "What happened?" "Nothing. The marshal thanked me for my civic duty and filed my report somewhere it would never see daylight. Western Continental is owned by Thomas Caldwell, one of the wealthiest men in Nevada, with connections all the way to Washington. The marshal wasn't going to cross him based on the word of a drunken doctor with a tragic past. So they came after you instead. They came after me with everything they had, accused me of being the smuggler, claimed I was stealing medical supplies and selling them, using my position to aid criminals, fabricating evidence to cover my own crimes. Within a week, I had warrants out for my arrest and a price on my head. So I ran." Clara absorbed this, her mind working through implications. "The drawings. In your journal. Some of them showed railroad camps, work crews. I was documenting what I saw, creating a visual record in case my written notes were destroyed. And the lawyer who came to see me, Blackwood. He works for Caldwell? Almost certainly. Caldwell has a dozen lawyers on retainer, all of them skilled at making problems disappear." Elias finally met her eyes again. "Which is why you need to distance yourself from me. Tell anyone who asks that I was just a worker, that you knew nothing about my past. Don't try to help me or defend me or get involved in any way. It's too late for that. I already wrote a letter testifying to your character. Clara, and I'm not taking it back." She stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, close enough to smell the soap he'd used that morning. You listen to me, Elias Ward. I've spent 3 years being careful, being safe, avoiding anything that might risk what little I have left. But I'm done with that. Because you know what I've learned? Safety is just another word for cowardice. And I won't be a coward anymore. This isn't about courage. It's about survival. These men are bullies. Rich bullies with fancy lawyers and bought judges, but bullies nonetheless. And the only power bullies have is the power we give them by being afraid. That's a noble sentiment, but did you do what they're accusing you of? The directness of the question seemed to catch him off guard. No, I swear to you, I never smuggled anything or aided criminals. The only crime I committed was threatening powerful men's profits. Then I believe you. Just like that? Just like that. Elias stared at her, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. The careful walls he'd built starting to crack, revealing the vulnerable man beneath. When he spoke, his voice was rough. Why? You barely know me. I know that you taught my son about stars and treated my animals with kindness. I know that you worked harder than any man I've ever employed and never asked for special treatment. I know that you draw pictures of your dead family because you're terrified of forgetting their faces. And I know, she paused, gathering courage. I know that when you look at me, you see me, not the widow or the employer or the woman struggling to keep a vineyard alive, just me. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither dared say. Elias's hands trembled slightly as he raised them, as if he might touch her face, then drop them again. Clara, I can't. I'm not. After Hannah, I swore I'd never. I'm not asking for promises. I'm just telling you the truth. The truth is I'm going to prison. Or worse, they'll send me back to Nevada and I'll disappear like those workers. Either way, getting close to me is dangerous. Maybe. But you want to know what I think? Clara closed the final distance between them, her voice dropping to a whisper. I think the most dangerous thing I've done in the last 3 years is nothing. I think playing it safe has nearly killed me in ways that have nothing to do with breathing. And I think... Time's up, Morton called from outside. Mrs. Whitmore, you need to leave now. Clara didn't move. Neither did Elias. They stood inches apart in the cramped cell, the air between them crackling with electricity and unspoken longing and the terrible awareness that this might be the last time they saw each other. I'll fight for you, Clara said. I don't know how yet, but I will. Please don't. Please just take care of yourself and James. Too late. I already wrote the letter. She smiled slightly. And I have a feeling I'm about to do much more than that. She turned toward the door, but Elias caught her hand. His grip was warm and strong and sent electricity shooting up her arm. Clara, thank you for believing me when you had no reason to. I have every reason. You're a good man, Elias Ward, and good men are too rare to abandon without a fight. She pulled away before she could do something foolish, like kiss him, like throw her arms around him and refuse to let go, and stepped out of the cell. Morton locked it behind her, his expression carefully neutral. Got what you needed? He asked. Yes. And Sheriff? You might want to look into Thomas Caldwell and Western Continental Railroad. I think you'll find there's more to this case than what's in those official reports. Morton's eyes narrowed. Ma'am, I'd be careful about making accusations. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just suggesting that a thorough investigation might turn up interesting information. You do believe in thorough investigations, don't you? She walked out before he could respond, her heart hammering against her ribs. The night air hit her face like cold water, sharp and clarifying. She'd just openly defied powerful men, had made it clear she wouldn't be intimidated into silence. It was possibly the most reckless thing she'd done since marrying Thomas and moving west. It was also the most alive she'd felt in 3 years. The ride home gave her time to think, to plan, to consider her next moves. She couldn't fight Caldwell and his lawyers directly. She had neither money nor influence. But she had something they didn't have, the truth. And she had connections in the valley, people who respected her, who'd known Thomas, who might be willing to help if they understood what was at stake. By the time she reached the vineyard, she had the skeleton of a plan. Antonio and Miguel were waiting on the porch, James presumably asleep upstairs. They stood when she climbed down from the wagon, their faces anxious. "How is he?" Antonio asked. "Scared, angry, but innocent." Clara tied the horse and joined them on the porch. "And I need your help." "Anything, Senora." "Tomorrow, I need you to take that letter to the Carson City Courthouse. But first, I need you to make copies, multiple copies, and I need addresses." She explained quickly what Elias had told her about Caldwell and Western Continental, about the workers who died or disappeared, about the systematic corruption that had turned accusations back on the whistleblower. Antonio listened intently, his weathered face hardening. "I know people who work railroad crews," he said when she finished. "If what Elias says is true, they will know. They will have stories." "Can you ask them?" Carefully, without putting them at risk. "Yes. And Miguel has a cousin who works for a newspaper in San Francisco. If we can give him evidence, real evidence, maybe he will print the story." Clara felt hope kindle in her chest. "That's good. That's a start. We need to make this public, need to make it too big for Caldwell to bury with money and lawyers." "But Senora," Miguel said carefully, "this is dangerous. These men, they have killed before. If they think you are a threat, let them think it. I'm tired of being afraid." The brothers exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then Antonio nodded. "Then we help. We will ask questions, gather stories, find evidence, but you must be careful. For James, if not for yourself." "I will. I promise." After they left, Clara sat alone on the porch in the darkness, her mind churning. She thought about Elias in that cell, about the way his hand had felt in hers, about the things she'd said and the things she'd left unspoken. She thought about Thomas, about whether he'd approve of what she was doing or think her mad for risking their son's security for a man she barely knew. But the truth was, she did know Elias. Maybe not the facts of his life, not the complete history, but she knew his character, knew it in the way he moved through the world, carefully, kindly, carrying his grief like a penance. She knew it in the gentle way he'd treated James, in the tireless work he'd never complained about, in the beautiful, heartbreaking drawings that told stories no words could capture. And she knew something else, something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She was falling for him. Maybe had already fallen, somewhere between his arrival in the fog and tonight's confession in the cell. It was foolish and impractical and potentially disastrous, but it was also true. As true as the stars wheeling overhead, as true as the autumn wind that rattled the bare vines. Clara Whitmore, the careful widow who'd sworn never to risk her heart again, was in love with a wanted man she might never see again. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with a fierce determination that burned away doubt. If Elias was going to be taken from her, by law or by violence or by the cruel machinations of powerful men, then she would fight with everything she had to prevent it. Not because she expected gratitude or reward or even success, but because love, real love, demanded nothing less than everything you could give. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the kind of October day that promised winter's approach. Clara woke early and found Antonio already in the kitchen, copying her letter in careful script. He'd made 5 copies, each identical, and had a list of addresses, judges, newspapers, federal officials in Sacramento and San Francisco. "If we send these to many places," he said, "they cannot silence them all. Someone will listen. Thank you, and be careful when you go to town. Blackwood or his people might be watching." Antonio smiled grimly. "They will not notice an old Mexican making deliveries. We are invisible to men like that." He rode out just after sunrise. Clara threw herself into work with fierce intensity, grateful for physical labor that kept her hands busy even as her mind raced. Old Peter worked alongside her in the pressing shed, operating the machinery with practiced ease, but she could feel his sidelong glances. "Something you want to say, Peter?" she asked finally. "Just wondering if you know what you're getting into, ma'am." "Probably not, but I'm getting into it anyway. Stubborn, just like your husband. I'll take that as a compliment." "It is one." Thomas never backed down from what he thought was right, even when it cost him. Peter's gnarled hands adjusted the press. "Just hope this doesn't cost you the same way." Clara didn't ask what he meant. She knew the valley's whispers, the rumors that Thomas had died because of a business deal gone wrong, Because he'd refused to sell water rights to a development company. She'd never had proof, had buried those suspicions with her husband because what good did it do to question what couldn't be changed? But maybe Peter was right. Maybe stubbornness ran in the family. Or maybe she'd just finally found something worth being stubborn about. James found her at midday, his face troubled. "Mama, is Elias coming back?" Clara set down her tools and knelt to her son's level. "I don't know, sweetheart. But he didn't do anything wrong, did he? Antonio says men are lying about him." "That's what I believe, yes." "Then why do the lawmen believe the lies?" How to explain corruption and wealth and power to an 8-year-old. How to make him understand that justice wasn't always just, that truth didn't always win, that good people sometimes suffered while bad people prospered? "Because the men telling lies are rich and important," Clara said carefully. "And sometimes people believe rich men just because they're rich, even when they shouldn't. That's not fair." "No, it's not." "So what do we do?" Clara pulled her son into a hug, breathing in the little boy's smell of him, dirt and sunshine and innocence. "We fight back. We tell the truth as loudly as we can and hope that enough people listen. And if they don't, then we keep fighting anyway, because that's what good people do." James pulled back, studying her face with unsettling intensity. "You like him, Elias. You like him the way you liked Papa." Clara's breath caught. Children saw so much more than adults realized, cut through pretense with unnerving clarity. She could lie, could deny, could deflect. But James deserved better than that. "Maybe I do," she admitted quietly. "Is that all right with you?" Her son considered this seriously. "Papa would want you to be happy. He told me that before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you didn't forget how to smile." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. "He said that?" "Yeah. And Mama? You smile more when Elias is around. Not all the time, but sometimes. And that's good." She hugged him again, tighter this time, overwhelmed by gratitude for this perceptive, generous-hearted boy who'd somehow forgiven her 3 years of barely functional grief. "I love you, James Whitmore." "I love you too." "And Mama? We're going to win, right? We're going to help Elias?" "We're going to try our hardest." "Good. Because he promised to teach me about Orion's sword, and he can't do that from jail." The simple pragmatism of childhood. Clara laughed despite herself, despite everything, and stood up with renewed purpose. James was right. They had to win. Because Elias had promises to keep, and she'd be damned if some corrupt railroad baron prevented him from keeping them. Antonio returned late in the afternoon, looking pleased with himself. "It is done. All letters delivered, and I spoke with my railroad contacts. They have stories, Senora. Bad stories about Western Continental and men who disappeared. They are willing to talk, but carefully." "Can you arrange a meeting?" "Tomorrow night. In town, at the cantina where they gather. They will speak to you if I vouch for you." "Thank you, Antonio. This could make all the difference." "Perhaps. But, Senora, I must tell you, there was a man watching the courthouse. When I delivered your letters, I saw him follow me for several blocks. I lost him in the market, but they know you are acting against them." Clara's stomach tightened, but she nodded. "I expected that. We'll be careful. You should take the rifle when you go places, and perhaps I should stay in the house with you and James at night, just to be safe." "I can't ask you to." "You are not asking. I am offering. Miguel will take the barn loft. Between us, we will keep watch." The necessity of such precautions should have terrified her. Instead, Clara felt a strange calm settle over her, the kind that came from accepting risk and moving forward anyway. She'd chosen this path. Now she'd walk it, wherever it led. That evening, she sat with James at the kitchen table after dinner, helping him with arithmetic. The lamplight cast warm shadows around the room, and for a moment she could almost pretend everything was normal, just another quiet evening in the farmhouse. No danger lurking outside, no man she loved locked in a cell awaiting transport to possible death. Almost. A knock at the door shattered the illusion. Antonio, who'd been reading in Thomas's old chair, stood immediately and gestured for Clara to stay back. He opened the door with one hand on the knife at his belt. A woman stood on the porch, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the kind of face that suggested intelligence and determination in equal measure. She carried a leather satchel and looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Whitmore, my name is Margaret Chen. I'm a journalist with the San Francisco Chronicle. May I speak with you about Elias Ward?" Clara's heart leaped. Miguel's cousin had worked fast. "Please, come in." Margaret entered, her sharp eyes taking in everything. The modest furnishings, the ledgers stacked on the desk, the rifle by the door, Antonio's protective stance. She accepted Clara's offer of coffee and settled at the table, pulling out a notebook. "I'll be direct," Margaret said. "I've been investigating Western Continental Railroad for 6 months. The company has a pattern of workplace deaths that far exceeds industry norms, and I've documented multiple instances of safety violations being covered up. But I can't prove the corruption goes to the top, to Thomas Caldwell himself. I need someone willing to testify, someone with direct knowledge." "Elias is that person," Clara said. "He witnessed everything, the deaths, the cover-ups, the bribes. He even found unmarked graves. Can he prove it? Does he have evidence?" "He kept records. I don't know where they are now, but he documented everything he saw." Margaret leaned forward. "If I can get to those records, if I can corroborate his testimony with my own investigation, I can publish a story that Caldwell can't bury. But I need access to Ward, and he's being transferred to San Francisco tomorrow. Once he's in federal custody, it becomes much harder. Then we need to act tonight." "How?" "He's locked up, and they're not going to let a reporter interview a prisoner." Clara thought fast. "The sheriff, Morton, he's not a bad man, just cautious. If we can convince him there's more to this case, that he's being used by Caldwell to cover up crimes, he might allow an interview, especially if we can offer him evidence." "What kind of evidence?" "Testimony from other railroad workers. Antonio has arranged a meeting tomorrow night, but maybe we can move it up. If we can get several workers to make statements to corroborate what Elias told authorities, it might be enough to delay the transfer," Margaret finished. "Give us time to investigate properly." "Exactly," Antonio spoke up from his position by the door. "I can gather them tonight. It will not be everyone, but enough. They are frightened, but if they know someone will listen, someone who can tell their story, yes, they will speak." "How long will you need?" Margaret asked. 2 hours, maybe 3. I must go to the camps, speak to them privately." "Do it. I'll wait here." Margaret turned back to Clara. "Mrs. Whitmore, I should warn you. Caldwell has resources most people can't imagine. If this story breaks, he'll come after everyone involved. Your reputation, your property, possibly your safety. Are you prepared for that?" Clara thought about Elias in that cell, about the quiet desperation in his eyes, about the feel of his hand in hers. She thought about James and the future she wanted for him, one where speaking truth wasn't dangerous, where powerful men couldn't destroy the innocent with impunity. "I'm prepared," she said simply. "Then let's bring down a railroad baron." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Antonio rode out to the camps while Clara and Margaret planned strategy. The journalist had years of experience, knew how to construct narratives that would capture attention and survive legal challenges. She walked Clara through what they'd need: multiple witnesses, documentary evidence, a timeline of events, proof of systematic corruption rather than isolated incidents. "The key," Margaret explained, "is showing pattern and intent. Caldwell will claim any deaths were accidents. Any violations were made by subordinates without his knowledge. We need to prove he knew, that he made deliberate choices that killed people to protect his profits." "Will Elias's testimony be enough? Combined with other witnesses and my investigation?" "Yes, I think so. But we need to keep him alive and free long enough to give it." The blunt assessment sent a chill through Clara. "You think they'd kill him?" "I think Caldwell has killed before to protect his interests. Ward is a direct threat, educated, credible, with first-hand knowledge. He's exactly the kind of witness that could bring down an empire." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry to be so stark, but you need to understand what we're up against." "I do, and I'm not backing down." "Good. Because once we publish this story, there's no going back." James had long since been sent to bed when Antonio returned with 4 men, railroad workers with calloused hands and wary eyes. They gathered around Clara's kitchen table, speaking in low voices while Margaret took notes in rapid shorthand. Their stories were harrowing. Manuel had watched his brother crushed by defective equipment that inspectors had been paid to approve. Chen had been beaten by foremen when he complained about unsafe conditions. Robert had helped bury 6 men in unmarked graves after a tunnel collapse that was blamed on worker error rather than inadequate support beams. And all of them had been threatened, directly or indirectly, with disappearance if they talked to authorities. "The company, they say we are replaceable," Manuel said, his English accented but clear. "They say if we die, they find others. Like we are not men with families, just bodies to use until they break." Margaret wrote furiously, asking probing questions, getting details, building a case. Clara made coffee and listened, her anger growing with each story. This wasn't just corporate negligence. It was systematic dehumanization, treating workers as disposable resources rather than human beings. And Elias had tried to stop it, had risked everything to expose it. By midnight, they had sworn statements from all 4 men, witnessed and signed. Margaret packed them carefully into her satchel. "This is good," she said. "Very good. With these testimonies and Ward's records, we have a real case. Now we need to present it to the sheriff before that morning transport leaves." "Will he listen?" Clara asked. "Only one way to find out." They rode to town before dawn, Clara, Margaret, and Antonio, with Miguel staying to guard James. The streets were empty, the windows dark, only a few lamps burning to mark the sheriff's office. Clara's hands were steady on the reins, her fear transformed into something harder and more useful. Purpose. Morton opened the door himself, looking rumpled and annoyed. "Mrs. Whitmore, it's 4 in the morning. What in the hell?" "We have evidence," Clara said. "Evidence that Elias Ward is innocent, that he's being framed by Thomas Caldwell to cover up systematic corruption and multiple murders. We need you to delay the transfer until this can be properly investigated." "That's a serious accusation, with serious evidence to back it up." Margaret stepped forward. "Sheriff Morton, I'm Margaret Chen with the San Francisco Chronicle. I've been investigating Western Continental Railroad for months, and I have testimony from multiple witnesses corroborating Ward's claims. If you proceed with this transfer without reviewing this evidence, you'll be complicit in a gross miscarriage of justice, and it will be front-page news." The threat wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. Morton looked at the satchel in Margaret's hands, at the determined faces of 3 people who clearly weren't leaving, and sighed heavily. "Come inside, and this had better be as substantial as you're claiming." They spread the documents on his desk, witness statements, timelines, Margaret's investigative notes, copies of Clara's original letter. Morton read slowly, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "Son of a bitch," he said quietly. "Caldwell. I never thought, the man's been to dinner at the governor's mansion." "Rich men can be criminals too," Margaret said, "sometimes especially rich men." "If this is true, if even half of this is true, then Ward's in serious danger. They'll want him silenced before trial. Which is why we need him protected, and we need time to investigate properly, to find his records, to build an airtight case." Morton rubbed his face with both hands. "The federal marshal is expecting him on the noon stage. If I refuse the transfer, I'll need a damned good reason." "You have 4 witness statements and evidence of ongoing investigation into potential capital crimes," Margaret said. "That's plenty of reason. Caldwell will raise hell. Let him. He raises it from the front page of the Chronicle, where everyone can see exactly what kind of man he is." The sheriff looked at Clara. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you understand what you're starting here? This isn't just about one man. This is about taking on one of the most powerful families in the West." "I understand, and I'm not backing down." Morton studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll delay the transfer pending further investigation, but Ward stays in custody until this is sorted out. I can't just release him on accusations alone." "That's fair," Clara said, relief flooding through her. "Can I see him? Tell him what's happening?" 5 minutes. "But Mrs. Whitmore?" Morton's expression was grave. "Watch your back. You've just made some very dangerous enemies." Clara walked back to the cells alone this time, her heart hammering. The door was still locked, and Elias still sat on that narrow cot, though now he looked up with the wary expectation of someone who'd given up hoping for good news. "Clara, what are you doing here? The sun's barely up. We delayed the transfer. We have witnesses, evidence, a journalist investigating Caldwell. You're not going anywhere today. She watched the information register, watched disbelief give way to cautious hope. Elias stood, crossed to the bars, his hands gripping the cold iron. What did you? I told you I'd fight for you. Did you think I was speaking poetically? I thought you were speaking emotionally. I didn't think you'd actually. He stopped, shook his head. Clara, you shouldn't have done this. The risk was worth it. And before you argue, before you try to protect me or push me away or do whatever noble self-sacrificing thing you're about to do, let me say something. She moved closer to the bars, close enough to see the exhaustion and confusion and desperate gratitude warring in his expression. I spent 3 years being safe. 3 years avoiding risk and feeling and anything that might hurt me again. And you know what? It didn't make me happy. It didn't make me whole. It just made me numb. But then you showed up in the fog, and you worked my vineyard, and you taught my son about stars, and you looked at me like I was a person, not just a widow or a burden or a problem to be managed. And I realized something. What? His voice was barely a whisper. That I'd rather risk everything fighting for something real than spend the rest of my life safe and empty. Even if, her voice caught, even if you don't feel the same way, even if this is all one-sided and foolish, I needed you to know. Elias's hands tightened on the bars until his knuckles went white. Clara, God, I'm so bad at this. After Hannah, I thought I swore I wouldn't. I'm not asking for promises. But you deserve them. His eyes were fierce now, burning with something that made her breath catch. You deserve someone who can give you certainty and safety and all the things I can't even guarantee for myself right now. But Clara, he reached through the bars, his hand finding hers. You're wrong about one thing. This isn't one-sided. I've been fighting what I feel since the day I arrived because I knew I had no right to feel it, knew I'd only bring trouble to your door. And here we are, exactly where I feared we'd end up. Which is, with you in danger because of me. With me behind bars unable to protect you, with everything complicated and messy and impossible. Clara laced her fingers through his, holding tight. I don't need easy. I need real. And this, whatever this is between us, it's the realest thing I've felt in years. They stood like that, hands clasped through iron bars, the impossible gulf between them made bearable by touch. Clara could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire to hold on to what she was offering, battling against his instinct to protect her by pushing her away. Time's up, Morton called from the hallway, sounding almost apologetic. Clara squeezed Elias's hand once more, then released it. This isn't over. We're going to clear your name, and when you walk out of here, we're going to figure out what comes next, together. Clara, don't argue. Just trust me the way I'm trusting you. She walked away before he could protest, her hand still tingling from his touch, her heart both lighter and heavier than before. Because she'd said the words, had made herself vulnerable in a way she'd sworn never to do again. And while Elias hadn't exactly reciprocated, hadn't said, I love you, or made grand declarations, his eyes had told her everything she needed to know. He felt it too. This strange, inconvenient, possibly doomed connection that had sprung up between a widow and a wanted man. And that would have to be enough for now. Outside, Margaret and Antonio were waiting by the wagon. The journalist looked energized rather than exhausted despite the sleepless night. I'm heading back to San Francisco, she said. I need to dig into Caldwell's business dealings, find the paper trail that connects him directly to the deaths and cover-ups. It'll take a few days, maybe a week. Can you hold things together here? We'll manage, Claire said. Good. And Mrs. Whitmore, thank you. Stories like this, they don't get told without people like you being willing to stand up. Whatever happens, you should be proud of that. After Margaret rode away, Clara and Antonio sat in the wagon as dawn broke over the town. The sky turned gold and pink, painting everything in soft light that seemed to promise hope. What now? Antonio asked. Now we wait, we work, we keep living. Clara gathered the reins, and we get ready for whatever Caldwell throws at us next. Because he would throw something, that much was certain. Men like Thomas Caldwell didn't become wealthy and powerful by accepting defeat gracefully. He'd fight back, would use every resource at his disposal to discredit them, silence them, destroy them if necessary. But Clara was ready. She'd chosen this battle, had walked into it with open eyes. And if standing up for truth and justice and the man she was falling in love with meant risking everything she'd built, then she'd risk it gladly. The sun rose higher as they drove home, burning away the morning fog and revealing the valley in all its autumn glory. The vineyard awaited them, the harvest nearly complete, another season drawing toward its close. But this year felt different, not an ending, but a beginning, not a continuation of grief, but the possibility of something new. Clara thought about Elias locked in that cell, about the impossible hope dawning in his eyes when she'd told him about the delayed transfer. She thought about the feel of his hand in hers, about the words he'd almost said, about the future that might, just might, be possible if they could survive what was coming. And she smiled, surprising herself with the unfamiliar expression. Because Antonio was right. She did smile more when Elias was around. And God willing, she'd have many more reasons to smile in the days ahead. The smile faded 3 days later when Thomas Blackwood returned, this time with reinforcements. Clara was in the pressing shed when Miguel came running, his face pale beneath his tan. "Señora, men at the house, many men, with wagons." She dropped the tools and ran, Antonio close behind. What she saw made her blood freeze. 4 wagons sat in her yard and a dozen men were moving between them and her barn, carrying out equipment, barrels, tools, the small press Thomas had built himself in their first year. Frank has exercised that option. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. What activities? Making false accusations against respected businessmen, interfering with legal proceedings, associating with known criminals. The bank feels these behaviors indicate financial instability and poor judgment. His smile was razor thin. "I did warn you about the consequences of not cooperating." Antonio stepped forward, his hand on his knife. "You cannot do this. This is her land, her property. With all due respect, it's the bank's property until the loan is satisfied, which Mrs. Whitmore cannot do." Blackwood produced papers, waved them almost casually. "Everything is legal and properly documented. If she has concerns, she's welcome to retain a lawyer and file an appeal. Of course, that process takes months, and in the meantime, she'd lose everything. The equipment she needed to finish processing this year's crop, the tools necessary for next year's planting, possibly even the land itself. It was a perfect trap. Force her into legal battles she couldn't afford, drag out proceedings until she had nothing left to fight for, make her so desperate that accepting Caldwell's help became the only option. "You son of a bitch," Clara said softly. "This is Caldwell's doing." Mr. Caldwell is a concerned citizen who happens to have business relationships with several banks. What they do with that information is their prerogative. Blackwood tucked the papers away. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to complete." Clara watched helplessly as her livelihood was loaded onto wagons. The men worked efficiently, clearly experienced at this sort of extraction. They took the pressing equipment, the aging barrels, even the hand tools hanging in the barn. When one tried to take the draft horse, Antonio blocked his path. "That horse belongs to the boy. It was his father's. You touch it, you answer to me." The man looked to Blackwood, who considered, then waved dismissively. "Fine, leave the horse. We're here for equipment, not livestock." Small mercies. Clara felt numb, disconnected from her body as she watched 3 years of careful management dismantled in under an hour. She thought about the mortgage payment she'd been so close to making, about the successful harvest that should have secured their future, about how quickly security could evaporate when powerful men decided you were expendable. James appeared in the doorway, his eyes huge with confusion and fear. "Mama, why are they taking our things?" Clara went to him, pulled him close. "It's a mistake, sweetheart. A legal complication. We'll sort it out." But James was 8, not stupid. That man on the porch. He came before. He scared you. "He didn't scare me." "Yes, he did. I saw your face." Her son's voice dropped to a whisper. "Is this because of Elias? Because we're trying to help him?" The perceptiveness of children. Clara couldn't lie, couldn't shield him from the truth that he'd already intuited. Yes, some men are angry that we're fighting for what's right, so they're trying to make us stop. Will it work? She looked down at her son, at the fierce determination building in his young face, and felt something hard and sharp crystallize in her chest. No, it won't work. Because Whitmores don't quit, remember? Your father taught me that. He taught me too. He said Whitmores finish what they start. That's right. And we started this fight, so we're going to finish it. The wagons rolled out an hour later, laden with everything that made the vineyard functional. Blackwood paused before leaving, his expression almost sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. It's not too late, you know. Drop this crusade, withdraw your statements, and I can speak to the bank. Have all this returned within a week, the loan terms restored. You can go back to your quiet life and everyone's happy. Except the men who died in Caldwell's railroad camps. Except the families who lost fathers and brothers and sons to his greed. Except Elias, rotting in a cell for the crime of having a conscience. Clara's voice was steel. So, no thank you. I'll take my chances with honest poverty over complicit comfort. Your choice. But when you're living in that house with no way to make wine, no way to pay your bills, no way to feed your son, remember you chose this. Remember I offered you a way out. After he left, Clara stood in the empty barn and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes of despair. She pressed her palms against the rough wood of a support beam, let the tears come hot and furious, and imagined all the things she'd like to say and do to Thomas Caldwell and his pet lawyer. Then she wiped her face, straightened her spine, and walked back into the sunlight. Antonio, Miguel, and old Peter stood waiting, their expressions grim but determined. So, Antonio said, what do we do now? Clara looked around at what remained, the vines themselves, the house, the barn structure, the land. They'd taken equipment but not knowledge, tools but not will, machinery but not the fundamental assets that made a vineyard work. Now we improvise. We still have grapes in the cellar that need processing. We may not have the proper equipment, but people made wine for thousands of years before modern presses existed. We'll figure it out. And the mortgage? Old Peter asked. I'll deal with that when the time comes. Right now, we focus on what we can control. But controlling anything felt increasingly impossible as the days passed. The story Margaret Chen published hit San Francisco like a bombshell, front page of the Chronicle, complete with witness testimony, documentation of deaths, and clear accusations against Thomas Caldwell and Western Continental. For exactly 1 day, it felt like victory. Then Caldwell's legal machine roared to life. By the second day, 3 witnesses had recanted their statements, claiming they'd been coerced or misunderstood. By the third, the Chronicle printed a retraction of several unsubstantiated claims, citing threats of lawsuits. By the fourth, Margaret Chen herself appeared at the vineyard looking exhausted and defeated. They got to my editor, she said, accepting Clara's offer of coffee with shaking hands. Caldwell owns stock in half the businesses that advertise in the paper. He threatened to pull all of it, bankrupt the Chronicle entirely, unless we retracted. And the witnesses, God, Clara, they scared them. Chen's family received death threats. Manuel's daughter was followed home from school by men in suits. They made it clear what would happen if the testimonies stood. So they all backed down. Can you blame them? These are working people with families to protect. They can't fight Caldwell's lawyers and hired thugs. Margaret set down her cup with a sharp click. I'm so sorry. I thought we had him. I really did. Clara felt the last of her optimism crumble. What about Elias? Does this mean they'll transfer him now? I don't know. Morton's been under enormous pressure from federal authorities to release Ward into their custody. He's held out longer than most would have, but without the witness testimony. Then we've lost. I didn't say that. Margaret leaned forward, intensity burning in her tired eyes. The story's out there now. People read it before the retraction. They know something's wrong, even if they can't prove it. And Caldwell's overreaction, the speed and viciousness of his response, that tells me we got close to something he desperately wants hidden. What good does close do us? He's still winning. For now. But powerful men make mistakes when they're scared. We keep pressure on, keep digging, and eventually he'll slip up. Margaret pulled out her notebook. I've been investigating his financial records. There's something there, some irregularity I can't quite pin down. large payments to shell companies, money moving through accounts that don't quite make sense. If I can trace it back to payoffs or bribes. How long will that take? Weeks, maybe months. Elias doesn't have that kind of time. The blunt truth hung between them. Without witnesses, without evidence that could stand up in court, Elias would be convicted on Caldwell's fabricated charges. He'd go to prison or worse, disappear like those railroad workers, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere that no one would think to look. Unless Clara could find another way. That night, after James was asleep and the workers had retreated to their quarters, Clara sat at Thomas's desk and went through her options. She could sell the land, but who'd buy it with the title clouded by foreclosure proceedings? She could beg the bank for mercy, but they were Caldwell's creatures, would show no flexibility. She could hire a lawyer. With what money? She could run and abandon Elias and everything she'd fought for, or she could do something desperate. The idea came to her slowly, built from fragments of overheard conversations and remembered stories. Thomas Caldwell was powerful, but even powerful men had enemies. And in the tangled world of Western business, where railroad companies and mining interests and land developers all competed for dominance, enemies could become useful allies. Clara knew of one man in particular, Samuel Price, who ran the Southern Pacific Line that competed directly with Caldwell's Western Continental. The two had been locked in bitter rivalry for years, fighting over routes and rights of way and government contracts. Price was hardly a saint, railroad barons rarely were, but he might have reasons to see Caldwell taken down that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with profit. It was a devil's bargain, using one corrupt system to fight another, allying with a man who probably had his own skeletons buried deep. But Clara was out of options, out of time, and out of patience with trying to fight fair against people who'd never played fair a day in their lives. She wrote a letter that night, carefully worded, explaining what she knew about Caldwell's operation and suggesting that Price might find the information commercially valuable. She mentioned the deaths, the cover-ups, the systematic corruption that gave Western Continental unfair advantages over competitors, and she made it clear that she had access to someone who could provide detailed testimony, if that someone could be kept alive and free long enough to give it. Antonio agreed to deliver the letter personally, riding to San Francisco to place it directly in Price's hands. "You are sure about this, Senora?" "Price, he is not a good man. Neither is Caldwell, but at least Price has reasons to want him destroyed. I'll take motivated self-interest over abstract justice at this point." "Your husband, he would not approve." "My husband is dead, and I'm doing what I have to do to protect what's left." Clara's voice was harder than she intended. "I'm sorry. That was harsh. But true. And perhaps Thomas would understand. Sometimes we must make deals with devils to fight demons." After Antonio left, Clara tried to sleep, but couldn't. She kept seeing Elias in that cell, kept hearing his voice saying her name, kept feeling the pressure of his hand through the bars. The memory of it made her ache with longing and frustration in equal measure. She wanted to go to him, to tell him what she'd done, to assure him she hadn't given up, but Morton had stopped allowing visits after the Chronicle article. "Too much scrutiny," he'd said apologetically. "Too many eyes watching." Clara understood the position she'd put him in. He'd stuck his neck out delaying the transfer, had risked his own career to buy them time. But understanding didn't make the separation easier. 2 days passed with no response from Price. Clara worked the vineyard by hand, doing what little could be done without proper equipment. The remaining grapes were pressed using improvised methods, feet in barrels, like ancient times, with James helping and finding it more adventure than hardship. They salvaged what they could of the harvest, but Clara knew it wouldn't be enough. Not enough wine to sell, not enough money to pay the mortgage even if the bank would accept payment, not enough security to face the winter ahead. On the third day, a carriage arrived, fine black lacquer with brass fittings and a driver in livery. A man emerged, tall and silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe. Samuel Price had come himself. He studied the vineyard with assessing eyes, the kind that calculated value and weakness simultaneously. When he spoke, his voice was cultured, East Coast educated, with just a hint of steel beneath the polish. "Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for your letter. It made for fascinating reading." "Mr. Price, I'm surprised you came personally." "When someone offers to hand me Thomas Caldwell's head on a platter, I make personal appearances." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I assume you want something in return. Protection for Elias Ward, legal representation, security, whatever it takes to keep him alive until he can testify. And evidence that can stand up in court, documents, financial records, something that connects Caldwell directly to the crimes Ward witnessed." That's asking quite a lot. I'm offering quite a lot. Ward knows everything about Western Continental's operations. Safety violations, bribery schemes, where the bodies are buried. Literally. That information could destroy Caldwell and leave his territory wide open for competitors. Price walked along the fence line, hands clasped behind his back. "You're aware that using Ward's testimony for commercial gain rather than justice might be seen as ethically questionable. I'm aware that ethics are a luxury for people who aren't watching everything they own get stolen by corrupt bankers. Right now, I'll take whatever works." Practical. I appreciate that. He turned to face her. "Here's what I can offer. My lawyers can file injunctions blocking Ward's transfer, tie it up in court for weeks. I have investigators who can dig into Caldwell's finances, find the smoking gun your journalist friend couldn't locate. And I can provide security, men to watch your property, ensure no unfortunate accidents befall you or your son. In exchange for Ward's complete cooperation, every detail, every document, every shred of evidence he possesses, and exclusive testimony in any legal proceedings I might initiate against Western Continental." Price's smile turned sharp. "I'm not doing this out of altruism, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm doing it because destroying Caldwell serves my interests. But our interests happen to align, which makes us temporary allies. How temporary? Until Caldwell is ruined and his assets are available for acquisition. After that, you and Ward are on your own." It was exactly what Clara had expected. A business transaction, cold and calculated, with no pretense of friendship or morality. And she accepted it without hesitation because it was the only option that might actually work. "When can your lawyers start?" "They already have. I took the liberty of filing preliminary motions yesterday as soon as I received your letter. Ward won't be transferred this week, possibly not this month." Price produced papers from his jacket. "I'll need your signature on a few documents. Authorization for my legal team to act on Ward's behalf, statement of facts as you understand them, that sort of thing." Clara read quickly, her years of managing the vineyard having taught her to parse legal language. Everything seemed straightforward. Price was essentially taking over Elias's defense in exchange for rights to use any testimony against Caldwell commercially. It was manipulative and exploitative and possibly the smartest thing she'd done since this whole mess started. She signed. "Excellent." Price tucked the papers away. "My men will arrive tomorrow to provide security. Don't be alarmed, they're professionals, former Pinkertons mostly, very discreet. And Mrs. Whitmore, a word of advice." "Yes?" "Caldwell will retaliate. He'll see this alliance for what it is and respond aggressively. My lawyers can protect Ward legally, but you're more exposed. Be careful. Watch your back. And if anyone makes threats or attempts intimidation, document everything and contact me immediately." After he left, Clara stood in her yard feeling like she'd just made a pact with the devil. But if the devil could keep Elias alive and bring down Thomas Caldwell, then she'd gladly shake his hand and worry about the consequences later. True to Price's word, 4 men arrived the next morning, hard-faced, competent, armed. They took positions around the property without fanfare, professional enough not to disrupt daily work, but visible enough to discourage casual threats. James was fascinated by them until Clara firmly explained they were not to be bothered with questions or requests for stories. "But Mama, that one has a gun like in my adventure books." "James, leave them alone. They're here to work, not entertain you." The security made Clara feel simultaneously safer and more aware of how much danger they were actually in. These men weren't here for show. Price genuinely believed Caldwell might resort to violence. The thought kept her awake at night, every sound magnified, every shadow suspicious. A week after Price's visit, Morton finally allowed Clara to see Elias again. She rode to town with 2 of Price's men following at a discreet distance. Protection or surveillance, she wasn't entirely sure. The sheriff looked harassed, dark circles under his eyes, when he let her in. 10 minutes. And Mrs. Whitmore? Tell Ward he's got powerful friends now. Price's lawyers have made my life hell, but they're also keeping the federal marshals at bay. Whatever you did, it's working. Elias stood when she entered the cell, and her breath caught at the sight of him. He'd lost weight, his face gaunt and shadowed, his eyes holding a wildness that hadn't been there before. But when he saw her, something softened, and for a moment he looked almost like the man who'd arrived in the fog all those weeks ago. "Clara. God, it's good to see you." "You too. Are they treating you all right?" "Well enough. Morton's decent, considering, but Clara, I heard about what happened. The foreclosure, your equipment being seized. I'm so sorry. This is exactly what I feared." "Stop. Don't apologize for other people's cruelty." She moved closer to the bars. "I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." "That doesn't sound promising." "I made a deal with Samuel Price. He's providing legal representation and security in exchange for your testimony against Caldwell." Elias's expression darkened. "Price is as corrupt as Caldwell. You're just trading one devil for another." "Maybe, but this devil wants to keep you alive, which puts him ahead of the alternatives." Clara kept her voice firm despite his obvious anger. "I'm out of options, Elias. The witnesses recanted, the newspaper retracted, Caldwell's destroying everything I have piece by piece. Price can actually fight him, has the money and lawyers and motivation to do it. So yes, I made a deal. And I'd do it again. Using my testimony for Price's commercial gain will also expose Caldwell's crimes and save those workers' lives. Does it matter if justice comes wrapped in profit motive, as long as it comes?" Elias gripped the bars, his knuckles white. "It matters because men like Price don't care about justice. They care about winning. And when you make deals with people like that, you become complicit in their corruption." "Then I'm complicit. I can live with that if it means you live at all." The raw honesty of it seemed to deflate his anger. He closed his eyes, breathing hard. "Clara, you don't understand what you're getting into. Price's people, they're not just lawyers and security. They're fixers and enforcers and people who make problems disappear. You've put yourself in his debt, and men like that always collect. Let them. I'll pay whatever price I have to." "Even your soul?" "I don't have the luxury of worrying about my soul right now. I'm worried about keeping you alive and keeping my son safe and keeping a roof over our heads. Everything else is theoretical philosophy I can't afford." They stood in tense silence, separated by iron and ideology. Clara understood his objections. Hell, part of her agreed with them. But theory and practice diverged sharply when you were drowning. You grabbed whatever floated by, worried about whether it was the right life raft later. "I know you think I'm making a mistake," she said quietly. "And maybe I am, but I'd rather make mistakes fighting than achieve purity through inaction. So I made a deal with the devil because the devil I was fighting had all the advantages. And if that makes me morally compromised, then I'll accept that label and keep moving forward." Elias opened his eyes, and something in them had shifted. "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm sitting in a cell passing judgment on the woman who's risking everything to save me, which makes me a self-righteous hypocrite. You're scared. You're worried about me. I understand. It's more than that." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Clara, I'm terrified of dragging you down with me. Every time you make yourself more visible, every alliance you form, every risk you take, it makes you more of a target. And if something happens to you because of me, then that's my choice to make, not yours to prevent." "Is it? What about James? If Caldwell's people come after you, if Price's association puts you in danger, James is protected. Price provided security, and Antonio and Miguel watch him constantly. He's safer now than he was before." Clara reached through the bars, finding his hand. "Stop trying to protect me by pushing me away. It won't work, and it's wasting time we don't have." His fingers laced through hers, holding tight. "I don't know how to do this. How to let someone care about me again. It terrifies me more than prison, more than Caldwell, more than anything that's happened." "I know. But you're doing it anyway, which makes you braver than you think. Or more foolish. Maybe both." She managed a small smile. "We can be foolish and brave together. Face whatever comes side by side instead of alone." Elias pulled her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles with desperate tenderness. "If we survive this, when we survive this. When we survive this," he corrected, "I'm going to court you properly. Take you to dinner, bring you flowers, do all the things I should have done if we'd met under normal circumstances instead of in the middle of a conspiracy and corruption case. I don't need flowers. I need you to keep fighting. Then I will. For you. For James. For all those workers whose stories need to be told. His eyes held hers. And because you're right, I'd rather die fighting than survive by staying silent. Morton interrupted then, gruffly announcing time was up. Clara squeezed Elias's hand once more, imprinting the feel of it in her memory to carry her through the days ahead. Walking out of that jail felt harder each time, like leaving pieces of herself behind those bars. But she had work to do. Price's lawyers needed detailed information. His investigators needed guidance, and she needed to keep the vineyard functioning with whatever makeshift solution she could devise. Grief and longing were luxuries she couldn't afford right now. The battle was just beginning, and she'd need every ounce of strength to see it through. The next week brought developments faster than Clara could process them. Price's investigators uncovered financial records showing Caldwell had been systematically bribing federal officials, payments disguised as consulting fees, gifts funneled through shell companies, a paper trail that connected directly to the falsified safety reports. It wasn't complete proof yet, but it was enough to generate interest from authorities not in Caldwell's pocket. Margaret Chen printed a follow-up story, this time in a Sacramento newspaper whose editor couldn't be bought or intimidated. The article detailed the new evidence and raised questions about why Western Continental's remarkably low safety incident rate didn't match the mysteriously high death toll among workers. It was careful, hedged with legal language, but damning nonetheless. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, public opinion began to shift. Letters appeared in various newspapers questioning Caldwell's business practices. A rival politician started making speeches about railroad safety reform. Workers at other companies began coming forward with their own stories of abuse and neglect, creating a groundswell that couldn't be easily suppressed. Clara watched it build with cautious hope tempered by experience. She'd learned not to count on victory until it was absolute and irreversible. Too many times she'd thought they were winning only to have Caldwell strike back harder. The strike came on a cold November evening 3 weeks after her deal with Price. Clara was putting James to bed when she heard shouting from outside. Antonio's voice raised in alarm, running footsteps, the unmistakable crack of gunfire. She grabbed the rifle and ran downstairs, her heart hammering. Through the window she saw flames. The barn was burning, fire already consuming the old wooden structure where Elias had slept just weeks ago. Price's security men were running toward it with buckets while Antonio and Miguel worked the pump, but Clara could tell it was futile. The fire had too much of a head start. One of Price's men appeared at her door, breathing hard. "Ma'am, you and the boy need to come with me. Now. This was arson, and whoever said it might still be around." "My barn is gone. But you're alive, and we're keeping it that way. Please, Mrs. Whitmore, we need to move." Clara ran back upstairs, grabbed a terrified James from his bed, and let herself be hustled out to a waiting wagon. They drove to town surrounded by armed men, the night sky behind them glowing orange with destruction. James clung to her, crying quietly, while Clara stared at nothing and felt the last of her security burn away into ash. They were given rooms at the hotel, Price's expense, the desk clerk explained nervously. 2 security men posted themselves in the hallway while Clara got James settled. Her son finally fell asleep near midnight, exhausted by fear, while Clara sat in a chair by the window and watched the street below. She should have anticipated this, should have known Caldwell would escalate when legal pressure mounted. The barn was a warning. Next time it might be the house, or worse. She thought about her earlier confidence, her declaration that she'd fight no matter what, and wondered if she'd been dangerously naive. A knock at the door made her jump. She grabbed the rifle she'd brought, approached cautiously. "Who is it?" "Samuel Price, Mrs. Whitmore." "May I come in?" She opened the door to find the railroad baron looking unusually disheveled, his silver hair windblown and his expression grim. He entered quickly, glanced at James sleeping in the bedroom, and kept his voice low. "I apologize for the late hour, but we need to discuss security. Caldwell's people set that fire. My investigators found evidence of accelerant and forced entry. This was a direct attack, and it won't be the last. I gathered as much. I'm moving you to San Francisco. My personal residence has security that can't be easily breached, and it gets you out of Caldwell's immediate reach. Clara's first instinct was to refuse, to insist on standing her ground, but she looked at James sleeping, thought about what might happen if the next attack came when they were less fortunate, and swallowed her pride. For how long? Until the trial. My lawyers have accelerated proceedings. Ward will testify before a grand jury next month. If the indictment comes through, Caldwell will be too busy defending himself to bother with revenge. If it doesn't, Price's expression was unreadable. Well, then we'll reassess. And my vineyard? I can't just abandon it. Your workers can manage the winter preparations under my security supervision. The vineyard will be there when you return. He paused. Mrs. Whitmore, I realize this isn't what you wanted, but Caldwell crossed a line tonight. He's not just playing legal games anymore. He's willing to use violence. And I won't have your death on my conscience, not when you're helping me destroy him. The transactional nature of his concern should have bothered her. Instead, Clara found it almost comforting. At least with Price, she knew where she stood. He was protecting her out of self-interest, which made his protection reliable in a way that pure altruism never could be. We'll leave in the morning, she said. Tonight would be better. Clara looked at her sleeping son, thought about waking him again, dragging him out into the night. But she thought about the barn burning, about whoever had set that fire potentially watching the hotel, waiting for another opportunity. Give me 20 minutes to pack. They rode out in darkness, Clara and James bundled into a covered carriage with armed outriders fore and aft. James slept against her shoulder while Clara watched the valley disappear behind them, her heart heavy with the loss that went beyond burned buildings. She was leaving the home she'd shared with Thomas, the land they'd worked together, the life she'd built from grief and determination. But she was also moving toward something, toward justice for Elias, toward safety for James, toward some resolution of the impossible situation she'd stumbled into. And sometimes moving forward meant leaving things behind, no matter how much it hurt. The journey to San Francisco took 2 days, stopping at safe houses Price had arranged. By the time they arrived at his mansion on Nob Hill, Clara was exhausted and disoriented, feeling like she'd stepped into someone else's life. The house was enormous. 3 stories of Victorian opulence with servants and electric lights, and a level of luxury that made her vineyard farmhouse look like a shed. A housekeeper showed them to a suite of rooms that was larger than Clara's entire first floor. James stared around with wide eyes, touching velvet curtains and marble fixtures like they might disappear if he looked away. This is like a palace, he whispered. It's temporary, Clara reminded him. We're guests here, not residents. We'll go home as soon as it's safe. But as days turned into weeks, temporary began to feel increasingly permanent. Price provided everything they needed: food, clothing, tutors for James, even a small salary for Clara's consultation on the case against Caldwell. She spent hours with his lawyers, going over every detail she knew, every conversation she'd had with Elias, every piece of evidence that might prove useful, and slowly, piece by piece, the case came together. Price's investigators found more unmarked graves, located families of disappeared workers, uncovered bribery schemes that reached all the way to the state capitol. Margaret Chen coordinated with other journalists, building a media narrative that made Caldwell's position increasingly untenable. And through it all, Elias remained in that cell in Sonoma, protected by legal injunctions and Price's influence, waiting for his chance to testify. Clara was finally allowed to see him again in mid-December, escorted by Price's lawyers to where Elias was now being held in a San Francisco facility pending the grand jury. He looked better, well-fed, rested, though the haunted look in his eyes hadn't completely faded. Clara, his voice cracked on her name. They told me about the fire. Are you all right? Is James? We're fine. Staying at Price's mansion, living in luxury while you're stuck in here. It hardly seems fair. I don't care about fair. I care that you're safe. He reached through the bars, and she took his hands without hesitation. I heard about the case. Price's lawyers say it's solid, that the grand jury will almost certainly indict. That's what they tell me too. Another few weeks and you'll be testifying, putting Caldwell away for good. And then what? What happens after? The question hung between them, weighted with all the uncertainty of their situation. They'd been so focused on survival, on fighting Caldwell, on making it through each day, that neither had really considered what came next. "I don't know," Clara admitted. "Go back to the vineyard, I suppose. Try to rebuild, pay off debts, make a life again." "And us? Is there an us once this is over?" Her heart seized at the vulnerability in his voice. "Do you want there to be?" "More than I've wanted anything in years. But Clara, I have nothing to offer you. No money, no property, no prospects, just a history of failure and loss and bad decisions. You have yourself. That's enough." "Is it? You deserve someone stable, someone who can provide. I deserve someone who sees me, who treats my son with kindness, who's willing to fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous." Clara tightened her grip on his hands. "I deserve you, Elias Ward. And if you're willing, I'd like to see what we can build together once this nightmare is over." He pulled her closer to the bars, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, feel his breath on her face. "I love you. I should probably say it with more poetry or romance, but I'm terrified I'll lose my nerve if I don't just say it plain. I love you, Clara Whitmore, and when I'm free, if I'm freed, I want to spend whatever time I have left making you happy." Tears stung her eyes. "I love you too. Have for weeks, maybe longer, since before I even understood what I was feeling." They kissed through the bars, awkward, desperate, perfect. It tasted like hope and salt, and the promise of futures neither had dared imagine. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Elias pressed his forehead against the iron between them. "We're going to make it," he said. "We have to. Because I'm not losing you now that I've finally found you." "Then testify. Tell the truth. Bring Caldwell down." Clara touched his face through the bars. "And then come home to me." "Where's home?" "Wherever we decide to make it, together." The guard called time then, but Clara left with lightness in her chest that all of Caldwell's threats and Price's machinations couldn't diminish. Because love, real, honest, hard-won love, was worth fighting for. And they were so close now to winning, so close to the freedom that would let them build something real. Just a few more weeks. Just one more battle. And then, finally, they could begin. The few weeks stretched into a month as legal proceedings moved with the glacial pace of bureaucracy. Clara found herself trapped in a strange limbo, living in luxury while her life hung in suspension, waiting for a grand jury that kept postponing, for testimony that kept getting delayed, for justice that felt increasingly theoretical. James adapted better than she did. He made friends with the gardener's son, discovered a love of books in Price's extensive library, and seemed almost content in their temporary haven. Clara envied his resilience even as she worried about what would happen when they returned to reality. "How did you go back to a modest farmhouse after living in a mansion? How did you explain that security and stability were illusions that could evaporate overnight?" Price himself was often absent, managing his empire from offices downtown, but when present he treated Clara with distant courtesy. She was a useful asset, a means to an end, and he never pretended otherwise. She appreciated the honesty even as it reminded her how precarious her position was. The moment Elias testified and Caldwell fell, Price's interest in protecting them would evaporate. Christmas came and went with subdued celebration. Clara bought James a small gift with money from her consulting salary, and they decorated a tree in their suite with ornaments borrowed from Price's staff. It felt wrong celebrating while Elias remained locked up, while their future hung uncertain, while people who'd helped them lived in fear of Caldwell's revenge. But James was 8, and 8-year-olds deserved Christmas joy regardless of adult complications. So Clara smiled and sang carols and pretended everything would be fine, even as worry gnawed at her constantly. The call finally came on January 3rd, 1892. Price's head lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Morrison, appeared at breakfast with news that the grand jury would convene in 1 week. Elias would testify on January 10th, and if the indictment came through, Caldwell would be arrested immediately. "We're ready," Morrison said, spreading papers across the dining table. "We have documentation, witness testimony, financial records. Ward's statement will be the capstone, a first-hand account from a credible witness with medical credentials and no apparent motive to lie." "Except staying alive," Clara said quietly. "That's a pretty strong motive." which is why we've prepared extensively for cross-examination. Caldwell's lawyers will attack Ward's character, suggest he's fabricating testimony to avoid his own prosecution. We need him to remain calm, stick to facts, not let them provoke him into emotional responses that can be twisted. He can do that. Elias is careful with words. I hope you're right, because if his testimony falls apart, if he appears unreliable or vindictive, the grand jury could decline to indict. And then all of this, Morrison gestured vaguely at the papers, the mansion, the months of investigation, will have been for nothing. The weight of that reality settled over Clara like a shroud. So much depending on one man's testimony, on whether 12 strangers found him credible, on whether justice could survive against money and power and influence. She thought about all the people who'd helped them, all the risks taken, all the sacrifices made. And she thought about what would happen if they lost. Caldwell would destroy them, completely, methodically, without mercy. The barn burning would look like a gentle warning compared to what he'd do to people who'd tried and failed to bring him down. Clara would lose the vineyard, probably lose custody of James to some manufactured claim of unfitness, possibly lose her freedom or her life. And Elias? She couldn't let herself think about what would happen to Elias. The week before testimony passed in a blur of preparation, Morrison drilled Clara on her own potential testimony. She'd be called to establish Elias's character, to describe his work ethic and integrity, to counter any character assassination Caldwell's lawyers attempted. She practiced staying calm under hostile questioning, learned to answer precisely without volunteering extra information, rehearsed her responses until they felt mechanical. You're doing well, Morrison said after one particularly grueling practice session. But remember, on the stand, let emotion show through. The jury needs to see you as human, as someone genuinely invested in truth rather than an actor reciting lines. I'm not sure I can control emotion once I'm up there. Good. Controlled emotion is powerful. Just avoid breaking down completely or losing your temper. Righteous anger is acceptable. Hysteria or rage is not. The clinical assessment of how much feeling was legally permissible would have been funny if the stakes weren't so high. Clara found herself studying her own responses, monitoring her reactions, treating her emotional life like evidence to be managed and presented. It was exhausting. 2 days before the testimony, Morrison brought darker news. One of the workers who'd agreed to testify, Robert, who'd helped bury bodies after the tunnel collapse, had disappeared. His family claimed he'd left to find work in Oregon, but the timing was suspect and the fear in his wife's eyes told the real story. Caldwell's people got to him, Morrison said flatly, probably offered money and threats in equal measure. We still have other witnesses, but losing Robert weakens the corroboration. Can't you subpoena him? Force him to appear? Not if we can't find him. And frankly, a terrified witness who recants on the stand does more harm than no witness at all. Morrison's expression was grim. This is what we're up against. Caldwell has unlimited resources to make problems disappear. We need Ward's testimony to be absolutely bulletproof because every other piece of evidence will be attacked, undermined, or eliminated. Clara felt the foundation of their case cracking. What if others disappear? What if Elias gets scared and... He won't. Price's people are watching him round the clock, and he knows this is his only chance. He'll testify. Morrison paused. The question is whether the jury will believe him. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of her suite, looking out over San Francisco's glittering lights, and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down. They'd come so far, fought so hard, sacrificed so much, but victory was still just a possibility, not a guarantee. And the cost of failure was unthinkable. She thought about the moment this had all started, Elias emerging from fog, asking for work, his storm-gray eyes holding secrets she'd been foolish enough to want to uncover. If she could go back knowing everything that would follow, would she still hire him? Would she still choose this path that had led to barn burnings and threats, and living as a prisoner in a gilded cage? The answer came without hesitation. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Because the alternative, safety through silence, security through complicity, would have killed something essential in her soul. At least this way, whatever happened, she'd fought. She'd stood up. She'd chosen love and justice over comfort and cowardice. And if that meant losing everything, then at least she'd lose it with her integrity intact. The morning of January 10th dawned cold and gray, San Francisco wrapped in fog so thick Clara could barely see across the street. She dressed carefully in her best clothes, the dark green dress she'd worn to Thomas's funeral, somber and respectable. James stayed behind with Price's housekeeper, protesting that he wanted to come, that he wanted to support Elias. "This isn't appropriate for children," Clara said, kneeling to his level. "The things that will be discussed. I know bad things happened. I'm not a baby. I know you're not. But sometimes protecting people you love means keeping them away from certain kinds of pain. And I need you here, safe, so I can focus on helping Elias without worrying about you." James considered this with his unsettling maturity. "Will you tell him I'm thinking about him? That I hope he does good?" "I will, I promise." The courthouse was an imposing granite building downtown, its columns and arches designed to inspire respect for law and order. Clara climbed the steps with Morrison and two of Price's security men, her stomach churning with anxiety. Inside, the halls echoed with footsteps and low conversations, lawyers in dark suits conferring with clients, witnesses waiting nervously on benches. And there, flanked by more security, was Elias. He wore new clothes, a proper suit that Price had provided, his hair trimmed, his face clean-shaven. He looked almost respectable, nothing like the haggard drifter who'd appeared at her gate months ago. But his eyes were the same, storm gray and intense, and when he saw Clara they lit with something that made her heart clench. "You came," he said, as if there'd been any doubt. "Of course I came. I'll be testifying too later. Character witness." "Clara, I need to tell you something before this starts." Elias glanced at the lawyers and security, then lowered his voice. "If this goes wrong, if they don't indict, or if Caldwell finds a way to twist this, I want you to take James and disappear. Price can help you relocate, start over somewhere Caldwell can't reach. Don't try to fight anymore, just survive. We're not going to lose, but if we do, then we'll figure it out together. I'm not running, and I'm not letting you face consequences alone." Clara touched his hand briefly, aware of all the eyes watching. "We're in this together, remember? Whatever comes." Morrison interrupted before Elias could respond. "They're ready for you, Ward. Remember everything we discussed. Stick to facts, stay calm, don't let them provoke you. This is your chance to tell the truth. Make it count." They led Elias away toward the grand jury room, and Clara was directed to a waiting area for witnesses. She sat on a hard wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and tried to pray, though she wasn't sure who she was praying to or what she was asking for. Just strength, maybe. Just the courage to see this through. Hours passed. Clara had no way of knowing what was happening in that closed room, whether Elias was being believed or destroyed, whether their case was building or crumbling. Other witnesses came and went. Antonio testified, his weathered face stoic as he was led in and out. Margaret Chen appeared briefly, giving Clara an encouraging nod before being called. Workers whose names Clara didn't know filed past, each one potentially offering corroboration or being intimidated into silence. And through it all, she waited. Morrison finally appeared in late afternoon, his expression carefully neutral. "They want you now. Remember what we practiced, calm, factual. Let emotion show, but don't let it overwhelm you." Clara stood on shaking legs and followed him into the grand jury room. It was smaller than she'd imagined, just a regular courtroom with 23 jurors seated in the box, a stenographer recording everything, and a prosecutor questioning witnesses. No judge, no defense attorneys. This wasn't a trial yet, just an investigation to determine if charges were warranted. But Caldwell's presence loomed anyway. His influence felt in the expensive suits of observers in the back row, in the way certain jurors avoided eye contact, in the air of intimidation that money and power created even when physically absent. Clara was sworn in and took her seat. The prosecutor, a tired-looking man named Wheeler, began with basic questions. How did she know Elias Ward? How long had he worked for her? What was his character like? She answered carefully, describing Elias's work ethic and integrity, his gentleness with James, his obvious grief over his lost family. She painted a picture of a decent man trying to rebuild after tragedy, someone incapable of the fabrications he was accused of creating. Then Wheeler asked about the night Elias was arrested, about what he told her in that cell. Clara recounted the conversation, his explanation of what he'd witnessed at Western Continental, his decision to report corruption, the retaliation that followed. She watched the jurors' faces, trying to gauge reactions, but most remained impassive. "And you believed him?" Wheeler asked, "even though you'd only known him a few weeks?" "I believed him because everything he'd shown me suggested he was honest, and because when Caldwell's lawyer came to my property threatening me if I didn't stay silent, I knew Elias must have discovered something worth killing to keep hidden." A murmur ran through the observers. Wheeler pounced on it. "You're saying Thomas Caldwell personally threatened you?" "His lawyer did. Blackwood. He mentioned my mortgage, offered financial assistance in exchange for my cooperation. When I refused, my property was foreclosed on and my barn was burned. These aren't the actions of innocent men defending themselves against false accusations. These are the actions of guilty men trying to silence witnesses." "Objection!" One of the observers, clearly Caldwell's lawyer, stood up. "This is a grand jury proceeding, not a trial. The witness is offering speculation and character assassination. There's no judge to sustain objections here," Wheeler said dryly. "The witness is describing her personal experiences, which is exactly what grand jury testimony is for. Please continue, Mrs. Whitmore." Clara did, detailing every threat and intimidation, every suspicious event, every piece of evidence that Caldwell had more to hide than he'd ever admit. She felt her anger building as she spoke, remembered Morrison's advice about controlled emotion, and let it fuel her words without drowning them. By the time she finished, even the impassive jurors looked troubled. Wheeler thanked her, and Clara was dismissed. She walked out on trembling legs, feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized. She'd told the truth, had made people listen, had done everything she could to support Elias's testimony. Now it was just a matter of whether truth was enough. Morrison met her in the hallway. "You did well, very well." The jury was clearly moved. "What about Elias? How did his testimony go?" "Powerful. He was calm, detailed, credible. Caldwell's observers tried to rattle him with aggressive questions during breaks, but he held firm. If the jury believes him, and I think they will, the indictment is solid." "When will we know?" "They're deliberating now. Could be hours, could be days. Grand juries can take their time." But the jury moved faster than expected. Clara had barely settled into a waiting area when Morrison reappeared, his face split with a rare smile. "They've indicted all major charges: criminal negligence, bribery, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit murder. Warrants are being issued right now for Caldwell and 3 of his top executives." Relief hit Clara so hard she nearly collapsed. Morrison caught her elbow, steadying her, still grinning. "It's over. You won." "We won," Clara corrected. "All of us. Everyone who testified, who risked everything." "Yes, but you started it. You could have walked away, could have protected yourself and stayed silent. Instead, you fought. And now one of the most powerful men in California is going to face justice." Morrison's expression sobered. "Though I should warn you, the indictment is just the beginning. The trial could take months, and Caldwell won't go down without exhausting every appeal and legal maneuver available. This isn't truly over." Clara didn't care. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. The immediate danger had passed, the testimony had been believed, justice was moving forward. Whatever came next, at least they'd accomplished this much. "Can I see Elias?" "He's being processed out now. The charges against him are being dropped. Turns out it's hard to prosecute someone for crimes they were falsely accused of by a man who's now facing murder charges himself." Morrison checked his watch. "Give them 30 minutes to handle paperwork, then he's a free man." 30 minutes felt like hours. Clara paced the courthouse halls, unable to sit still, her mind spinning through everything that had happened and everything that still needed resolution. The vineyard was damaged but salvageable. Her reputation was complicated but intact. And Elias was free. Actually, genuinely free. The full impact of that didn't hit her until she saw him walking down the courthouse steps. No longer flanked by security or lawyers, just a man in a borrowed suit stepping into January sunshine. He paused at the bottom, looking around like he couldn't quite believe he was outside, unchained, unguarded. Then he saw Clara, and his face transformed. She ran to him without thinking, propriety be damned, and he caught her in his arms and lifted her off the ground. They stood there on the courthouse steps, holding each other while lawyers and reporters and curious onlookers flowed around them, and Clara felt something fundamental shift in her chest. This was real. This was happening. After months of fear and fighting and uncertainty, they'd actually won. "It's over," Elias whispered against her hair. "God, Clara, it's really over." "Not quite. There's still the trial." "I don't care about the trial. I did my part. I told the truth. Whatever happens to Caldwell now is up to judges and juries." He pulled back enough to see her face, his eyes bright with something that looked suspiciously like tears. "But we're done. We're free. We can finally start living instead of just surviving." Clara wanted to kiss him right there in public, wanted to grab his face and tell him everything she'd been holding back for months. But Morrison appeared beside them, clearing his throat apologetically. "Hate to interrupt, but Price wants to see you both. He's waiting at his office downtown." Of course. Their deal wasn't complete yet. Elias had testified, Caldwell was indicted, but Price would want to ensure his commercial interests were protected going forward. They were still assets to be managed, useful tools in his war against a rival. Price's office was opulent in the way only railroad baron money could achieve: dark wood paneling, leather furniture, a view of the bay that probably cost more than Clara's entire vineyard. Price himself stood at the window, his back to them as they entered, his silver hair catching afternoon light. "Congratulations," he said without turning. "You've accomplished what many thought impossible, bringing charges against Thomas Caldwell. My lawyers tell me the case is exceptionally strong. He'll almost certainly be convicted." "That's good news," Elias said cautiously, "for everyone who lost someone to his greed." "Indeed. And excellent news for me commercially. Western Continental's stock has already dropped 15%, and I'm positioned to acquire several of their key routes and contracts." Now Price turned, his expression businesslike. "Which brings me to why I wanted to see you both. Our arrangement has concluded successfully. Ward testified, Caldwell is ruined, and I've gotten what I needed. You're free to return to your lives." Clara had expected this, but hearing it stated so baldly still stung. "Just like that? You're done with us?" "I'm releasing you from any obligations. You're no longer under my protection, but you're also no longer in my debt. A clean break, as they say." Price pulled an envelope from his desk. "I am, however, a man who pays his debts. Mrs. Whitmore, you mortgaged your integrity and safety to help destroy my enemy. That deserves compensation beyond what our contract specified." He handed her the envelope. Clara opened it with shaking hands and found a bank draft for $10,000. More money than she'd see in 5 years of successful harvests. "I can't accept this." "You can and will. Consider it compensation for lost equipment, burned buildings, and general inconvenience." Price's tone allowed no argument. "And Ward, I've arranged a position for you at my company's medical facility if you want it. Good salary, decent hours, legitimate work. No obligation, just an offer." Elias glanced at Clara, some unspoken question passing between them, then back to Price. "That's generous, but I think I'm done with railroad medicine. I've had my fill of industrial accidents and compromised ethics." "Understandable. The offer remains open should you change your mind." Price moved toward the door, a clear dismissal. "I wish you both well. You fought admirably, and you won. That's rarer than you might think." They were shown out by an assistant, deposited back on the street with $10,000 and sudden, disorienting freedom. Clara looked at Elias, at the man she'd fought for and fallen for, and realized they were standing at a crossroads. Everything that had defined their relationship until now, the danger, the shared purpose, the fight for survival, was gone. Now they had to figure out who they were when they weren't fighting. "So," Elias said, his hands shoved in his pockets, "what now?" Clara thought about the vineyard, about James waiting at Price's mansion, about the life she'd built and nearly lost. She thought about the future that was suddenly possible, about what she wanted rather than what survival demanded. "Now we go get my son," she said firmly. "And then we go home. Back to Sonoma, back to the vineyard, back to the life that got interrupted when you showed up in the fog asking for work." "Clara, I meant what I said before, about courting you properly, about, I know, and you will. But first we go home." She took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars, the evidence of hard work and harder choices. Then we figure out the rest together. They collected James from the mansion, the boy practically vibrating with excitement when he learned Elias was free. The three of them rode the train back to Sonoma the next day, watching the California landscape roll past the windows, heading toward an uncertain but finally hopeful future. The vineyard looked different when they arrived. Smaller somehow, more vulnerable than Clara remembered. The burned remains of the barn stood as a charred reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. But the vines were there, dormant in winter sleep, but alive, waiting for spring. The house stood solid, the land endured. Antonio and Miguel had kept things running in their absence, pruning and maintaining with careful attention. They greeted Clara's return with quiet relief and Elias with backslaps and congratulations. The security detail Price had left behind packed up and departed, their services no longer needed now that Caldwell was in custody awaiting trial. And just like that, life began to resemble normal again. Except nothing was really normal, because everything had changed. Clara had changed, was harder and stronger and more certain of what she wanted. James had changed, grown up in ways that months of crisis accelerated. And Elias moved into the rebuilt barn loft, maintaining proper appearances, even as everyone understood the arrangement was temporary. He worked the vineyard alongside Antonio and Miguel, his medical skills unused but his capacity for labor unchanged. And in the evenings, after James was in bed, he and Clara would sit on the porch and talk about the trial proceedings they heard through Margaret Chen's articles, about plans for spring planting, about the future they were carefully building. "I want to do this right," Elias said one night in late January, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "Want to court you the way you deserve, give you time to be sure this is what you want. We've been through so much crisis and trauma. I need to know what we have is real outside of that context." "It's real. I know it's real. But time will prove it. And I want to prove it. Want to show James and the Valley and everyone that I'm not just some drifter taking advantage of a widow's loneliness. That I'm serious about you, about building a life together." Clara appreciated the sentiment even as it frustrated her. She'd fought so hard for their chance to be together. Couldn't they just be together now without all the performative courtship? But she understood his need to do this properly, to establish legitimacy in a world that loved to judge, especially widows who moved on too quickly. So she agreed to be courted. To Sunday dinners where Elias brought wildflowers and made conversation with James. To evening walks where they stayed a respectable distance apart despite wanting to be closer. To the slow, careful building of a relationship that everyone could see was proper and intentional and real. It was sweet. It was frustrating. It was exactly what they both needed. February brought news that Caldwell's trial was set for April. Morrison wrote regularly with updates. The defense was fighting hard but losing ground. More witnesses kept emerging. Public opinion had turned decisively against the railroad baron. It looked increasingly likely that conviction was inevitable. "They're offering plea deals," Morrison's latest letter reported. "Caldwell's lawyers want to negotiate reduced charges in exchange for guilty pleas and financial penalties. The prosecution is inclined to accept. It guarantees conviction without the uncertainty of trial. Thought you should know." Clara discussed it with Elias that evening on their usual porch conference. The sun was setting over the hills, painting everything gold and amber, the first hints of spring green showing on the vines. "How do you feel about a plea deal?" she asked. "Does it matter to you whether he goes to trial?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon. "I want him punished. I want everyone to know what he did, want his crimes exposed in open court. But I also want it to be over. Want to stop living in the shadow of this, stop having every conversation circle back to Caldwell and Western Continental and everything that happened. So you'd accept the plea. If it means he's convicted, pays restitution to families, loses his empire? Yes, I'd accept that." He turned to look at her. "Would you?" Clara thought about justice and vengeance, about the difference between punishment and closure. She thought about all the energy she'd poured into this fight, all the sacrifice and risk. And she realized that what she wanted most wasn't to see Caldwell destroyed. It was to see him irrelevant, to take away his power to hurt people, then forget he ever existed. "Yes, I'd accept it too, as long as it's over." The plea deal was finalized in March. Caldwell pled guilty to multiple charges of criminal negligence and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, fined an amount that effectively bankrupted his company, and barred from ever serving as a corporate officer again. Western Continental was dissolved, its assets sold off to pay restitution to victims' families. It wasn't everything. The murder charges had been reduced, and 15 years felt light for so many deaths. But it was something. It was acknowledgement of guilt, consequences for actions, justice delayed but not entirely denied. Margaret Chen wrote a final article detailing the plea and its implications, noting that this represented a rare victory for ordinary workers against corporate power. She interviewed Clara and Elias for the piece, and Clara found herself struggling to articulate what this all meant. "I don't feel triumphant," she admitted to Margaret. "I feel tired and relieved and ready to move on. Is that wrong? Should I be more celebratory? You're human. You fought hard and you won, but the cost was high. It's okay to be ready for the fighting to be over." Margaret set down her pencil. "For what it's worth, you both should be proud. You stood up when it would have been easier and safer to stay silent. That matters more than you know." After the article ran, life finally began to settle into actual routine. Spring planting started, the vines awakening from winter dormancy. Clara used Price's money to replace equipment, repair the barn, pay off the mortgage entirely so no bank could ever threaten her again. She hired additional workers for the season, rebuilt what had been destroyed, planned for a future that finally felt secure. And through it all, Elias was there, working alongside her, teaching James about medicine and drawing and the names of birds, becoming part of the fabric of their lives so gradually that Clara couldn't pinpoint when he'd stopped being a guest and become family. On a warm evening in early April, 6 months after his arrival in the fog, Elias asked Clara to walk with him to the old oak tree that marked the western boundary of the vineyard. The sun was setting, the sky on fire with color, and Clara knew what was coming before he'd said a word. He pulled a small box from his pocket, worn velvet that looked like it had seen better days. Inside was a simple gold band, nothing fancy, but unmistakably a ring meant for promises. "This was my grandmother's," Elias said quietly. "The only thing of value I still own. I've been carrying it since Virginia, not sure what I'd ever do with it, not imagining I'd ever have reason to offer it to anyone." He took the ring out, held it up to the dying light. "Clara Whitmore, you saved my life in more ways than pulling me from legal trouble. You reminded me why living matters, what's worth fighting for, that good people still exist in a world that often feels devoid of goodness. And I know I have nothing to offer you but myself. No fortune, no grand prospects, just a man trying to be better than his worst moments. But if that's enough, if I'm enough, then I'd like to spend whatever years I have left proving I'm worthy of the faith you showed me." Clara felt tears streaming down her face, hot and fast, carrying months of fear and hope and love finally allowed to exist without crisis overwhelming it. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes, if you'll have me. If James approves. If you think a drifter who arrived in the fog has earned the right to stay forever." She laughed through tears, took his face in both hands. "You're not a drifter. You're the man I love, the man my son adores, the man who taught me I could be more than just a widow surviving day to day." She kissed him softly, tasting salt and promise. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring on her finger, too loose, would need resizing, but perfect nonetheless, and pulled her close. They stood under the old oak as darkness fell and stars emerged, holding each other like they'd wanted to for months but hadn't allowed themselves while propriety and crisis intervened. "When?" Elias asked eventually. "I know you'll want to do this properly. Have it announced. Let people prepare. Soon as we can arrange it. I'm done waiting, done being careful, done pretending patience I don't feel." Clara pulled back to look at him. "Unless you want a long engagement. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night and never spend another day wondering if I'm allowed to love you openly. So no, I don't want a long engagement." They agreed on June, early summer, after spring planting but before harvest madness began. A simple ceremony in town, nothing elaborate, just family and friends bearing witness to promises they'd both thought they'd never make again. James took the news with solemn consideration when they told him that evening. So Elias would be my papa? Not like my real papa, but a new papa? If you want that, Elias said carefully, I'd never try to replace your father, but I'd be honored to be another father figure, someone who helps raise you and teach you and love you. Would we have the same last name? If your mother agrees, yes, you'd be James Ward, or we could keep Whitmore if that's important to you. James thought about this seriously. Can I be James Whitmore Ward? Keep both? Clara's heart clenched at her son's wisdom, honoring the past while embracing the future, refusing to choose when he could have both. Yes, sweetheart, that's perfect. Then okay, you can marry Mama. James considered. And Elias, thank you for coming back, for not leaving like you could have. I'll always come back, Elias promised. That's what family does. The weeks leading to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation that felt surreal after so many months of crisis. Clara found herself shopping for a dress, not black mourning clothes or practical workwear, but an actual wedding dress in cream silk that made her feel like a girl again instead of a battle-worn widow. James needed new clothes too, and Elias insisted on buying a proper suit despite Clara's protests that Price's borrowed one was perfectly adequate. I'm marrying you in clothes I own, he said firmly, not borrowed finery that reminds everyone I showed up with nothing. No one cares about that. I care. Let me have this bit of pride, Clara. So she let him, understanding that this wasn't really about clothes. It was about Elias establishing himself as a man who could provide, who brought value beyond his labor and his testimony. The Valley had watched their entire courtship, had witnessed the fight against Caldwell, had seen Clara nearly lose everything. Now Elias needed to show them, needed to show himself, that he was worthy of the life they were building together. The invitations went out in early May, simple cards announcing the marriage of Clara Whitmore and Elias Ward on June 15th at the town church. The responses came back quickly, mostly positive, though Clara noticed a few pointed silences from families who still thought her remarriage was too soon or Elias too disreputable. She found she didn't care. 3 years of managing opinions had taught her that some people would judge no matter what she did, and their approval wasn't worth compromising her happiness. Margaret Chen wrote asking if she could cover the wedding for the Chronicle, a feel-good follow-up to the Caldwell story, showing that justice had personal victories as well as legal ones. Clara agreed on the condition that it be tasteful and brief. She had no desire to become a public symbol or inspiration. She just wanted to marry the man she loved and get on with living. Antonio and Miguel threw themselves into preparing the vineyard for the wedding celebration that would follow the ceremony. They strung lights between the vines, built a dance floor from salvaged barn wood, arranged for musicians from the valley. It was more elaborate than Clara had intended, but the workers insisted. This was their victory too, their chance to celebrate survival and the defeat of men who'd treated them as disposable. You fought for us, Antonio said when Clara protested the expense and effort. Let us celebrate for you. 2 weeks before the wedding, a letter arrived from Virginia, Elias's sister Hannah, whom he'd lost touch with during his wandering years. Margaret's article had reached her somehow, and she'd written expressing joy at her brother's happiness and regret that distance prevented her attendance. The letter was warm and kind, full of memories of Elias before tragedy had broken him, and it moved Clara to read about the man he'd been. She says you were always the gentle one, Clara said that evening, sitting beside Elias on the porch. That you cried when your childhood dog died and spent weeks nursing an injured bird back to health. I was soft. My brothers used to mock me for it. Elias took the letter, reading his sister's words with visible emotion. I thought I'd lost that part of myself in the war. Seeing so much death, so much suffering, it hardens you, makes gentleness seem like weakness. It's not weakness. It's strength that requires more courage than hardness ever will. You sound like my sister. She used to say something similar. He folded the letter carefully. I should write back. Let her know about James, about the vineyard, about how I found my way to something resembling peace. We could visit her someday. After harvest, maybe. Let her meet her nephew by marriage. The idea seemed to startle him. You'd want that, to travel all the way to Virginia. Why not? The vineyard won't collapse if we're gone a few weeks. And James should know his extended family, should understand he's part of something larger than just the three of us. Elias pulled her close, his voice rough with emotion. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God every day that you took a chance on a stranger in the fog. Clara thought about that morning 6 months ago, about the choice she'd made to hire him despite every practical reason to turn him away. It had seemed like such a small decision at the time, just giving work to someone who needed it. But small choices rippled outward in ways impossible to predict, becoming turning points disguised as ordinary moments. I think we deserved each other, she said quietly. Two broken people who refused to stay broken, who chose to fight when fighting seemed impossible. The day before the wedding brought unexpected visitors. A carriage arrived in late afternoon, fine but not ostentatious, and Samuel Price himself emerged with a woman Clara had never met. His wife, Eleanor, a handsome older woman with intelligent eyes and a warm smile. Mrs. Whitmore, Price said with his usual formal courtesy, I hope we're not intruding. My wife insisted on meeting the woman who brought down Thomas Caldwell, and I've learned not to argue with Eleanor when she's determined. Eleanor Price stepped forward, taking Clara's hands in hers. Please forgive the impromptu visit. Samuel told me about everything you endured, and I wanted to express my admiration personally. What you did, standing up to Caldwell, fighting when it would have been safer to submit, that took extraordinary courage. Clara found herself liking Eleanor immediately, despite her initial wariness. I didn't have much choice. Sometimes you fight or you lose everything worth having. Many people lose everything rather than fight. You're rare, Mrs. Whitmore. Eleanor glanced at the vineyard, the preparations visible in the distance. I understand congratulations are in order. You're marrying tomorrow. Yes, Elias Ward, the man whose testimony helped convict Caldwell. How wonderfully romantic, a love story emerging from crisis and danger. Eleanor smiled genuinely. We won't stay long. I know you must be busy with preparations, but I wanted to bring you a wedding gift. She gestured to the carriage, and a servant brought forward a large wrapped package. Inside, Clara found an exquisite set of crystal glasses, 12 each of wine, water, and champagne glasses. Clearly expensive, too fine for everyday use. These are too much, Clara protested. Nonsense, consider them an investment. Samuel tells me your vineyard produces excellent wine. When you're ready to expand distribution, we'd like to discuss carrying your bottles in our dining cars. Nothing says luxury like California wine served in crystal on a transcontinental journey. It was a business opportunity disguised as a gift, which somehow made it more acceptable. Price wasn't being charitable. He was cultivating a supplier, building relationships that served his interests. Clara appreciated the honesty of it. I'll consider it after the wedding, after harvest, when life settles into something resembling normal. Of course, take your time. The offer stands. Eleanor pressed Clara's hand warmly. Be happy, Mrs. Whitmore. You've earned it more than most. After they left, Elias found Clara in the kitchen, staring at the crystal glasses with an expression he couldn't quite read. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. That's what's strange. She looked up at him. 6 months ago, I was barely surviving.